Hello. First time here? Welcome. If you're back for more, it's great to have you. Where are you watching from and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Now sit back and relax. This happened a few years ago in my hometown. I won't reveal the location to respect my best friend's privacy, but everyone should be aware of situations like this, as they seem to be happening more often. My best friend from undergrad, let's call her Maria, and I were inseparable. We worked together, studied the same subjects, shared most of the same classes and hobbies, and had the same circle of friends. We even lived close to each other. As a result, we spent nearly all our time together, so being alone was a rarity. Keep that in mind as the story unfolds. One day, Maria was picking up her cats from a friend's house and parked on the street outside. After placing the cats in the car, she ran inside to lock the front door. It only took about 10 seconds, just long enough to lock the door and rush back. But she forgot to lock her car. About halfway to her house, she realized that her purse, which had makeup, a few $100s, checks from work, her passport, all her IDs and cards, and apartment bills with her address on them, was missing from the passenger seat. She had been running errands to prepare for a trip back to her hometown, which is why she had so many important items with her. Pulling over, she checked her bank account online and saw that someone had already attempted to use her card at a gas station just 5 minutes away. She quickly canceled her card and drove home. When she told me what had happened, I pointed out that whoever took her purse must have been watching her, and she agreed. She reported the theft to the police but didn't expect much to come of it since we lived in an area notorious for theft at the time. About a month later, she received a call from a detective who said they had found all her items, except for the cash. Maria told the detective it wasn't a big deal since she had already replaced everything. The detective paused and then told her they wouldn't be returning her items at all, as they had become evidence in an ongoing investigation. When Maria asked what that meant, the detective explained that they had found her belongings with a woman known for being involved in drugs and human trafficking. Our state, unfortunately, is one of the hotspots for human trafficking in the US. Along with the stolen items, there were pictures of Maria from several months prior walking around our college campus and our work and hanging out with friends on her birthday. There were also photos of her friends and other girls that we didn't know. These people had her hometown address, her address in the state where we lived, where we worked, the places we ate and hung out at, her university ID card, knew that she had animals and where she walked them, where she did her banking, what kind of car she drove, and who her friends were. Naturally, her boyfriend, who was in the military, lost it and had his friends sit outside the house when he wasn't home and escort her to and from work at night for the next few months. It didn't seem like I was a target, but I still had my boyfriend use my car to drive me to and from work for a while, and I bought pepper spray for my keychain. In the aftermath of finding this out, we realized a few things. Despite being followed at fairly close range, somehow neither of us ever noticed somebody following us, probably because the person was a woman. Most of the opportunities for someone to take her, such as walking to her car or house at night, were probably missed because either her boyfriend or I were with her. They must have been learning the schedules of everyone around her, as well as to see when there were times she was truly alone. Since they already knew so much about her before stealing all of her information, there must be a big boss somewhere who has at least some information about her, including what she looks like. The one thing they didn't seem to have photos of was her hiking with her dogs. Either they didn't know she hiked, often alone, or they were worried it would be too obvious if someone were to follow her, thus tipping her off. And perhaps the most terrifying, if they decided after all this time to make a move and steal her things, they must have been planning to do something big fairly soon. It's likely they took her IDs in order to make fake ones to get her out of the country undetected. Unfortunately, I can't give an update, as nothing ever happened after the arrest, and every time she asks about the case, the detective says it's an active investigation and they cannot disclose any information. We have never actually seen the photos either. All of the explanation was done over the phone. It's been 3 years since all this happened, and even though we have moved past it, it still terrifies me to think about what would have happened if they hadn't found that woman. I urge everyone to be aware of their surroundings. Be wary of anyone following you, not just men. Stay with your friends. Check in on them to see if they made it home safe. And always lock your doors. Although this story is far from over, most of what I'll share happened around 12 years ago, in 2009, when I was still living with my parents. We just moved into the neighborhood when I was 13. Not long after, I discovered the woods across the road, and I sort of had to make it my sanctuary due to the bullying I was dealing with and all the chaos at home. There weren't many kids in the neighborhood, and the few that were around were older. The constant tension made me a nervous wreck, and any free time I had was spent alone. One day, I got curious and wandered into the woods. It didn't seem like anyone else was out there, and this gave me a strange sense of safety. It was something I hadn't felt in a long time. I found a small circle of cedar trees that formed a secret clearing and turned it into my personal clubhouse of sorts. Over time, I spent more and more time in that little area. Once, I even accidentally fell asleep and ended up spending the night out there. I thought my parents would freak out when they found out, but they never even noticed. That was all the excuse I needed. At first, I only camped in my clubhouse occasionally, but eventually, I started doing it more often. No one ever seemed to miss me, but I realized I'd need some real camping gear. I tried using stuff I had at home, but it wore out quickly. Asking my parents for money was out of the question. So I started going door to door, offering to mow lawns. I'd never mowed a lawn in my life, but that wasn't the point. The real problem was finding a lawnmower. I'd sneak my dad's mower out and use it for jobs, but eventually, I got caught and even got a beating for it. Luckily, by then, I'd saved enough to buy a cheap, terrible lawnmower of my own. It took every penny I'd saved, but it was a much safer way to earn money. Once I'd made back what I'd lost, I hopped on my barely working bike and rode the 5 miles to a small army surplus store. When I came back, I had an Alice pack stuffed with all sorts of gear that I thought I'd need. I was so excited to try everything out. I even skipped a whole week of school and camped out in my clubhouse. It was an addictive hobby, but something much more for me. It was the only source of safety and happiness I had. For the next however many years, I went to school just enough not to cause any trouble. I would go straight from school to my clubhouse every afternoon. By now, I'd come to see those woods as mine. Anybody in between would have been seen as an invader in my mind, and when that day came, I didn't think twice about striking back. It was a Sunday afternoon. I've been camping out all weekend and was taking the well-worn path to the creek to get water. Across the creek about 50 yards was an almost deserted road. I rarely saw anyone use it. I caught sight of a parked camper. The 2 men walking in and out of it never seemed to notice me, and when I returned a few hours later, they were still there. Only now they were drinking beers and mindlessly shooting guns. This made me furious, but when a stray bullet actually struck the water just feet from me, I had had enough. I ran the mile back home and called the sheriff. I assumed my call was anonymous, but now I'm not so sure. I made up a story that I had gotten lost and drove up on the men. I lied and said that they had threatened me with their guns, and I realized how wrong that is now, but I was young and angry. One morning, as I prepared for school, I overheard a news report about a big meth lab bust. Acting on an anonymous tip, sheriff's deputies found 2 men shooting guns on the country road. Upon further investigation, the camper the men were driving turned out to be a mobile meth lab. The 2 men were taken into custody and were being held pending bail hearings, and I knew this had to have been the call I made. The seriousness of the situation scared me, but I was confident no one would know that it was me that had made the call. And for the next year, I even followed the case. About 3 months before their sentencing hearing, I received an unnamed letter in the mail. And it simply said, "You mess with the wrong people, kid." A jolt of ice-cold fear shot through me, but I still doubted it was from the 2 men. Any doubt I had was removed when another came the next week. This one far clearer. "You better pray we get time served." I was too terrified at the time to wonder how they knew that it was me. I'm still not sure how they identified me, but the how no longer mattered. The letters continued to arrive. When the day of the hearing came, the news was not good. Both men were felons found with multiple firearms. Adding on the manufacturing charge and you get a minimum of 10 years, the judge was not feeling generous. He gave both of the men 20 years. I was sure my days on Earth were numbered. I stopped going to school and spent all my time in the woods. I wasn't foolish enough to think that it would keep me safe, but if I was going to die, I wanted to die somewhere I loved. A strange thing happened, though. The death I was expecting never came. Month after month, I became more confident that it all had been a joke or more than likely just an intimidation tactic. My life flew by, and this last 10 years has been a series of ups and downs. The meth heads have been the last thing on my mind. Then last week, a new anonymous letter showed up at my apartment. "You better write a will. The end is close at hand." I involuntarily dropped it like a hot potato. My girlfriend was with me and witnessed it. She picked up the letter and read it, and I could tell she was concerned, but I played it off as a prank and refused to explain. And just like that, a ghost from my past reappeared into the present. You can probably guess what this unwanted news had done to me. I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder everywhere I go. I'm terrified these monsters may go after my girlfriend and newborn child. Going to the cops was a brief consideration, but without any proof of who the sender is, I know there's not much they can do. My options seem to be limited. Without anyone else to talk to, anonymously emailing this in to tell my story. I'm not sure why. It could be because of the anonymity of the internet. There's not much more I can say other than to tell you all to be careful of the choices you make as a child. Wish me luck, and please pray for me and my family. My uncle is an avid outdoorsman with a touch of free-spirited wanderlust. He's been part of the Peace Corps twice, once in Kenya and again in Egypt. He's encountered some unsettling things during his time in those countries, including bizarre rituals and the aftermath of violent incidents. As for his lifestyle, he's always been the type to embrace the outdoors. He's especially close with a Native American friend who shares his passion for traditional hunting, using bow and arrow to connect more deeply with nature. His approach to life has always been about respecting the wild, hunting and gathering from the land, using everything to its fullest, and never taking modern comforts for granted. My uncle and his friend often hunted deer in southern Ohio, specifically in Hocking Hills, an area nestled near the Appalachian Mountains. Here's a bit about the place. For years, rumors have circulated about people living off the grid in the woods there, wild individuals who shun society. There are also whispers about cults operating in the forest. And, of course, there's the strange but persistent rumor of cannibalism in the area. The rumors gained momentum after reports surfaced of a local who had gone berserk in town, destroying property, and was later diagnosed with a rare condition similar to mad cow disease. But in humans, it's a deadly disease caused by a misfolded protein that destroys brain cells, essentially turning the brain into Swiss cheese. The odd thing about contracting prion disease, as it's known, is that it can be transmitted through eating human flesh, specifically brain tissue, or from animals consuming their own kind. It's not just cows eating cows, but humans eating humans too. That's the kind of bizarre backdrop my uncle and his buddy found themselves in when they set out on a moonlit night in Hocking Hills to hunt. They trekked deep into the woods, arriving at their tree perch high up in the pines, close to a clearing, so they could get a clear view of the area below. As the night wore on, my uncle had to step away from their perch to take care of business. It was pitch dark after a cloud covered the moon, and he hadn't brought a headlamp. He figured he'd wait for the cloud to pass or for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. But then, out of nowhere, he started hearing it screaming. It wasn't just any screaming, but a mix of maniacal laughter and shrill cries, unmistakably human. My uncle said it sounded like hyenas from his time in Kenya, but it was far more chilling, something that could freeze your blood. And this was happening in Ohio. Panic set in, and he bolted, running as fast as he could, ducking under brush and hiding behind rocks when the sound drew nearer. This was a guy who'd seen his fair share of disturbing things abroad, but this was unlike anything he'd experienced. Eventually, the moon broke through the clouds again, and he found himself back in the pine grove, near his buddy. The unsettling sounds continued, and my uncle, terrified, reached the tree where they had set up their perch. Barely able to get a grip, he climbed the tree in a frantic scramble, breaking his nails along the way. Once at the top, he urgently told his friend about the cannibals lurking in the woods. His friend just laughed, explaining that what my uncle had been hearing was just the sound of deer mating. Apparently, it's a rare phenomenon to hear such a thing, and they were fortunate to witness it. My uncle, shocked and still on edge, almost wanted to punch his friend in disbelief. Instead, they shared a laugh, relieved that it wasn't cannibals, though they did joke about how rough the night would be for any deer caught in the middle of all the activity. Not long after, a group of deer appeared in the clearing. My uncle and his friend got ready to take their shot, but just as suddenly, the deer stopped and all turned their heads in the same direction. Then, in a panic, they bolted away in a stampede. Both of them were confused, unsure of what was going on. That's when the figures emerged from the edge of the clearing. 3 or 4 people carrying something that looked like another person. They were still deep in the woods when these figures emerged from the shadows, stepping directly into the moonlight. What they were carrying looked like a body, definitely human, and it didn't look right. These people looked like they had been living off the land for way too long, their faces worn and their clothes ragged. On their bodies, there were dark purple stains. My uncle was about to ask his friend if he was seeing the same thing, but before he could speak, his buddy silenced him with a firm hand over his mouth. The group of people moved on, unaware of the hunter's perch. His friend's demeanor changed instantly. He got serious and began counting his arrows. After a tense half hour, my uncle's friend told him that they couldn't sleep that night and had to stay quiet. Then he started murmuring a soft, native chant. They stayed awake, and no one else came into the clearing. As dawn broke, bright and clear, the silence was eerie. There was no sign of the strange people from the night before. My uncle and his friend gathered their things and made their way down to the perch. They left most of their gear behind in a hurry to get out as fast as possible. Once they reached the truck parked on the road, they headed straight for the nearest ranger station to report what had happened. The rangers gave them breathalyzer tests, just in case the strange story was the result of too many beers. But they were sober, dead sober. They convinced the rangers that something was off, so a few of them came along to check out the clearing and for my uncle to retrieve his gear. While they were packing up, the rangers suddenly became agitated. My uncle approached them, and one of the rangers had found a few blood spots, leading them to believe there might be a blood trail. They tested the blood with their equipment, and it turned out to be human blood, not deer. My uncle decided it was time to leave before the situation escalated, so they headed back to their home later that day, still shaken. After settling in and cleaning up their hunting gear, my uncle's friend suddenly froze. He looked at my uncle and said that he had started the night with 2 quivers, each holding 6 arrows. Now, after recounting, he only had 9. 3 arrows were missing. He was certain that, when they had counted the arrows during the night, there were 12. They had left the gear securely fastened up at the perch when they left that morning. Someone must have been watching and taken the arrows while they were gone. His friend decided to get rid of his bow and arrows, saying that they had attracted bad spirits. He even performed a ritual with his tribe, and my uncle was part of it, to rid themselves of the dark spirits they had come into contact with. Later, they learned that the blood matched a missing persons case, and both men were questioned again. However, no human remains were ever found near the blood, and search dogs couldn't locate anything. The missing person was never found, and the case remained unsolved. The authorities concluded that a homicide couldn't be proven because, aside from my uncle and his friend, there were no witnesses. There was no evidence, so no crime could be established. The whole situation remained a mystery, but my uncle was convinced that the strange sounds he heard on his way back from the toilet weren't just deer in heat. That was the last time they hunted in Hocking Hills. In fact, they were even banned from returning for family hikes. To this day, I'm extremely cautious about hiking anywhere in the Appalachian Mountains. Last year, my roommate moved out of the house we had been renting together for the past 4 years. At that point, both of us had secured better jobs, earning more money, and the house we were in was starting to feel too cramped. It was only a matter of time before one of us decided to move out and get their own place. After he left, I ended up staying in the house for another year or two, using the extra space that had opened up. This event took place during the beginning of December. Our area was experiencing a series of severe snowstorms, and my office gave us the option to work from home for a few days. Naturally, I took the offer. I set up my office in my old roommate's bedroom and worked throughout the day. At one point, I heard a knock at the front door. I left the room to check who it was and found a man standing on the porch, wearing a heavy winter jacket. He didn't appear to be a delivery person or anything like that, just an ordinary guy. I opened the door, and a gust of snow and wind hit me. He smiled and apologized for the interruption, explaining that his car had gotten stuck in the snow just beside my house. He didn't have a phone, and he asked if he could borrow mine to call for help. Skeptical, I told him to hold on for a moment, closed the door, and went to the other side of the house. I peeked out the window to check the road he mentioned. Sure enough, there was a small SUV stuck in a snowbank near the curb. Now that I was more convinced he wasn't lying, I grabbed my jacket and put on shoes before going back outside. I still had my doubts, but I stood on the porch while he used my phone to call his brother, just in case. After a short call, the man handed me back my phone, thanked me, and walked away. I went back inside and checked from the window, seeing him climb into his car. Assuming everything was fine, I returned to my work. Around 7 p.m., I decided I had done enough for the day and took the rest of the night off. It was then that I remembered the man and his car, so I went to check on it. To my surprise, the car was still there, and I could see him moving around inside. It had been nearly 3 hours by that point, which made me wonder why he was still there. Maybe he was waiting for his brother to finish work and pick him up. Not sure what to think, I went to the kitchen, made some dinner, and sat down on the couch to watch TV. I stayed up until about 9:30, then went upstairs to shower and prepare for bed. I turned on the water and got into the shower, but a few minutes later, there was a loud, sudden banging on the front door. The noise startled me so badly that I froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sharp sound and the violent force of it. It felt like the walls were shaking, and I could hear the door handle being shaken aggressively. The chaos was so sudden that I didn't know what to do. I turned off the shower, quickly got dressed, and left my room. But as I walked down the hallway, everything stopped. It was completely silent. No more banging, no more noise. I stood still for a moment, hearing only the wind outside and feeling the eerie silence settle over me. I slowly walked downstairs and approached the front door. There was no one outside. I rushed to the window and saw that the car was still parked there, but the man was gone. Confused and uneasy, I called the police. When they arrived, they found multiple sets of footprints in the snow, but the storm had soon covered them up. They took the car's license plate and found a photo of the owner. From what I could tell, it was the same man I had helped earlier that day. The police waited a few days to see if he would turn up, but as far as I know, he never did. It's disturbing to think about what might have happened that night right outside my door. Was it the same man trying to get inside for some reason, or someone else with a more sinister motive? Most people think the man was trying to get away from someone and needed help, but what happened afterward remains a mystery. Where he is now and what he was running from are just some of the many unanswered questions from that night. The engine of my van had never seemed so loud as it did that night, when its once gentle hum suddenly felt like a death sentence. I had always believed that the dangers of camping came from wild animals or the elements, not from human predators who stalk their prey. I'd been living out of my converted van for 3 months, chasing the dream of freedom and adventure that so many people talk about. The concept was simple: work remotely, travel the country, and live life on my own terms. No rent, no schedules, just the open road and endless opportunities. On that particular evening, I thought I'd found the perfect spot for a bit of stealth camping. It was a secluded clearing off a little-used Forest Service road in Northern California. The towering redwoods formed a natural canopy, their ancient presence making me feel small and insignificant in the most beautiful way. I went through my usual routine, parking the van, setting up my portable solar panel, and preparing a simple dinner on my camping stove. As the sun sank behind the trees, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I sat back in my folding chair, sipping a beer, and feeling completely at peace. If only I had known then how quickly peace could be shattered. The first indication that something was wrong came around midnight. I had been asleep for a couple of hours when a sound woke me up with a jolt. At first, I couldn't identify it. A rhythmic crunching, out of place in the stillness of the forest. Then it hit me: footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose. My heart began to race as I peered out the small window of the van. The full moon cast an eerie light over the clearing. That's when I saw them. 3 men dressed in dark clothes, carrying what appeared to be rifles. They moved slowly and deliberately, scanning the area as if searching for something or someone. A wave of fear crashed over me as I realized the severity of the situation. These weren't park rangers or fellow campers. The way they moved, the weapons they carried, these men were hunters. And I had a sinking feeling that I was the prey. I dropped down, praying they hadn't seen me. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Had I unknowingly camped on private property? Was this some sort of militia patrol? Or was it something far more sinister? The footsteps drew closer, and I could hear low voices murmuring. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. These men meant business. I held my breath, willing my heart to stop pounding so loudly in my chest. A beam of light swept across my van and I froze. Had they spotted me? I heard one of the men say something, and the footsteps changed direction. Moving away from my vehicle, I allowed myself a small sigh of relief. But I knew I wasn't out of danger yet. For what felt like hours, I remained still, listening intently to every sound. The men seemed to be patrolling the area, their footsteps fading and then returning at regular intervals. I was trapped, unable to start the van and drive away without alerting them to my presence. As the night wore on, my mind conjured up increasingly terrifying scenarios. What if they were human traffickers looking for lonely travelers to abduct? Or maybe they were part of some dark web hunting game, where unsuspecting campers became unwilling participants in a deadly sport. Each time their footsteps neared my van, I held my breath, certain that this would be the moment they discovered me. But each time they passed by, continuing their patrol. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, and I was the mouse who didn't even know the rules. Around 3 a.m., I heard a new sound, the low rumble of an engine in the distance. The footsteps quickened, moving away from my van. I chanced to look out the window and saw the men converging on a dirt road at the edge of the clearing. A few moments later, a large truck appeared, its headlights off. The men gathered around the truck, and I strained to hear their conversation. I caught fragments: shipment, border, payment, that painted a disturbing picture. These weren't just any criminals. I had stumbled into the middle of a major smuggling operation. For the next hour, I watched as they unloaded crates from the truck, carrying them deeper into the forest. I didn't know what was in those crates, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there and fast. But how? My van was my only means of escape, but starting the engine would immediately give away my position. I was outnumbered and unarmed. My only hope was to somehow slip away unnoticed. I formulated a plan, risky as it was. I would wait until they made another trip into the forest with their crates. Then, I would push my van as far as I could with the engine off, hoping to get enough momentum to coast down the slight incline of the Forest Service road. Once I was far enough away, I'd start the engine and floor it. It was a desperate plan, but it was all I had. The next time the men disappeared into the trees, I made my move. With shaking hands, I quickly packed up my essential belongings into a backpack, just in case I had to abandon the van and flee on foot. Then, as quietly as I could, I opened the driver's side door. The hinges creaked, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet forest. I froze, certain I'd been discovered. But no shouts came, no running footsteps. Taking a deep breath, I slipped out of the van and moved to the back. Pushing a 2-ton vehicle is no easy feat, especially when you're trying to do it silently. Every muscle in my body strained as I leaned into the van, willing it to move. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't budge. Then, slowly, agonizingly, it began to roll. Inch by inch, I guided the van towards the road, my ears straining for any sound of returning footsteps. Sweat poured down my face, and my arms trembled with exertion. But the fear of discovery gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the crest of the small hill that led down to the main road. This was it, the point of no return. Once I let the van start rolling down the hill, there would be no turning back. I took one last look at the clearing. The truck was still there, its dark bulk ominous in the moonlight. There was no sign of the men, but I knew they could return at any moment. It was now or never. With a deep breath, I gave the van one final push and jumped into the driver's seat. The van began to roll slowly at first, then picking up speed as it descended the hill. The trees seemed to rush by, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, guiding the van down the twisting road. Each turn was a heart-stopping moment, the van's momentum threatening to send me careening into the trees. But somehow I managed to keep it on the path. As I neared the bottom of the hill, I knew it was time. I turned the key in the ignition, saying a silent prayer. The engine roared to life, shattering the night's silence. I stomped on the gas pedal and the van leaped forward. In my rearview mirror, I saw flashlights bobbing in the darkness. Shouts echoed through the trees. They had discovered my escape. I drove like I'd never driven before, taking each turn at breakneck speed. The van rattled and shook, protesting the abuse, but I couldn't slow down. In the distance, I heard the roar of another engine. They were in pursuit. For miles, I sped through the dark forest, taking random turns, my mind focused solely on losing my pursuers. Every set of headlights that appeared in my rearview mirror filled me with dread. Were they catching up? Had they called for backup? It wasn't until I reached a main highway that I allowed myself to exhale. Just a little. I merged into the thin late-night traffic, trying my best to appear calm despite my racing heart and trembling hands. I drove through the night, not stopping until the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. When I finally pulled into a rest stop, 100 miles away from that clearing, the weight of everything that had happened hit me like a wave. I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably as the fear and adrenaline finally found an outlet. In the days that followed, I wrestled with the decision of whether to go to the police. But what could I possibly tell them? I had no proof, no names, no specific location. In the end, I decided to put as much distance between myself and Northern California as I could. My dream of carefree van life was shattered. The open road, which once symbolized freedom, now felt riddled with hidden dangers. Every quiet forest, every isolated spot, seemed to hold the potential for unseen threats. I still live in my van and continue to travel, but now I stick to established campgrounds, well-lit areas, and places where other people are always nearby. The solitude I once craved has been replaced by a need for safety in numbers. On quiet nights, I find myself straining to listen for footsteps in the dark. The fear may have faded over time, but it never truly disappears. It's a constant reminder that freedom comes at a price, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who walk on two legs. In 2007, at 19 years old, I moved from my hometown to the nearest big city to attend university. The previous summer, I had worked 2 jobs, including one at a medieval store that was part of a larger chain. The shop sold everything from costumes and swords to jewelry, gargoyles, and figurines. I was a great employee during my time there, and when I told my manager I was moving and would have to quit, he kindly mentioned that one of the chain's other stores in the city I was moving to needed help. I was thrilled by the idea and couldn't wait. He forwarded my CV to the manager at the other store, and she replied enthusiastically, saying she'd be happy to hire me as soon as I arrived. Summer passed, and when September came, I started working at the new location. But before I dive into that, let me paint a picture of the surroundings. The store was in the oldest part of the city, and given that the city itself was 375 years old, the buildings had quite a bit of history to them. The street was narrow, cobbled, and long, bustling with tourists during the summer months. The store was located on the ground floor of a tall, very narrow building. The shop itself was roughly 16 feet wide and 65 feet deep, with cathedral ceilings that soared about 25 feet high. The upper floors were occupied by a lively bar or park. There was only one entrance, directly onto the street, and a large display window where we'd place mannequins dressed in our merchandise. At the very back of the store, there was another mannequin display window, but no door, as the street running parallel to ours was 35 feet below. The area had been built on sloping land, so every street leading to the river was lower than the next. This detail is important for the story. The only access to the store was through the front door. The moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air inside was heavy, stifling, and I immediately felt uneasy. But it was a good job, one that paid well and fit around my student schedule, so I tried to push my discomfort aside and got to work. I got along well with my new coworkers, made good friends with the manager, and everything seemed to be going great. Still, every time I had to close up shop alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The store was dark and long and narrow, lined with gargoyles, mirrors, swords, and mannequins. To close, you had to go all the way in the back in the storage room, flip off all the breakers, and then head back all the way to the front of the shop in pitch darkness to get out through the front door. Needless to say, I pretty much sprinted out of there as soon as the lights were off. Now we could chalk all of this uneasiness to the actual decor and architecture of this place, but not once did I feel any of that in my old store back in my hometown, and it had also been in the older part of town in a truly ancient building. Nothing tangible happened for a month or two. I was feeling weird and uneasy, but we couldn't say with any kind of certitude that something actually was there. And then around late fall, around Halloween actually, I know, cliché as fuck, stuff started happening. I was opening the store one morning, and as I entered the shop, a massive gargoyle that had been on a shelf at least 16 feet up was in the middle of the floor, like it had been put there on purpose facing the door, and that was not a light gargoyle by any means. Needless to say, I was a little unnerved. After that initial event, I would find stuff misplaced all the time. Things finding themselves in weird places like figurines in our bathroom, things on shelves switching places, hanging things crashing to the floor with no warning whatsoever, and then there were the steps. The floor of the store was old, worn hardwood that was very creaky and unforgiving. The slightest weight on it would make it crack and creak in the most obvious way, and it would start cracking all the time even if no one visible anyway, was stepping on it. There were many instances of hearing steps when I was just standing behind the cash register doing my thing. One night, I was working with my manager, let's call it Jay, and I let it slip that some weird things were happening. I was expecting her to laugh and reassure me that I was making things up, but the face she made definitely let me know that I wasn't the only one experiencing things, and she spilled everything. She told me about things moving, furniture rattling, steps, things flying off shelves, and feeling of a deep uneasiness. The unsettling thing though is that Jay is one of the most skeptical people I know, and even she was a little freaked out. So right there and then I had confirmation that at least some of my experiences were completely outlandish. I worked there through winter and things had stabilized in some way. Stuff was still happening, but I had started to get used to it and would just be mildly annoyed when I'd come in the morning and find things in odd places. By the time that summer rolled around, however, things had started escalating. Whatever was inhabiting the space had decided that moving things wasn't enough. It decided to start messing with us. Not just with me too, but the whole staff started experiencing things. Even my manager, with the sensitivity of a teaspoon and the most skeptical of employees, was starting to freak you out. An employee that I'll name C came in one morning, and she was sweeping the floor by the changing cabins that were covered in large mirrors, and she swore that she briefly saw a figure that definitely wasn't her in the reflection. When I got to work later that day, she was standing behind the cash register by the door, and it looked pretty shaken. She basically hadn't moved all day. They're too scared to get close to the mirrors, and honestly, I didn't really want to either. She told me how she'd brushed all of the little things off, but that was definitely something she'd never experienced before, and she was really freaked out. Another employee, he was definitely not the scaredy type. A big guy, very skeptical in his ways and definitely scoffed at our concerns. Well, one night as he was closing with our other male employee, he felt a very cold and very solid hand between his shoulder blades pushing him. It was the most physical thing that ever happened to any of us directly, and I find it very interesting that he picked one of the most skeptical out of all of us to manifest like that. In any case, he was obviously seriously freaked out. Just tried to explain it away, but, of course, how the hell do you justify an ice-cold hand pushing you in the middle of a store with nothing near you? He was actually very tall too. It towered over all of us by a head. So whatever touched him had to be tall too. Ake, who was present and standing behind the cash register a good 12 feet away in front of me. I didn't see anything touching. Incidentally had one of the scariest experiences too. It happened the summer before I started working. On a busy night, he was wrapping something for a client behind the cash register counter. On the wall behind the register, he hung some swords. It was actually the most structurally sound wall in the whole place, so it made sense to hang the heavier swords there, and they were permanently locked in heavy custom-made brackets with padlocks. So you really had to want that sword for us to unlock it because, man, it was a pain in the ass. But for no reason whatsoever, one of the swords fell out of one of the brackets and literally slashed his face out of nowhere. I mean, we kept those swords religiously locked. The odds of someone leaving a bracket open were slim to none, and even then, they were really heavy swords that needed some force to get off those brackets. Unfortunately, poor H needed to get 4 stitches on his cheek too. He was never the same after the incident too and was very affected by the vibe in the store. I think he was highly sensitive and definitely picked up on the negative energy in the store too. He quit the following summer because he'd just become too scared of working on his own there. Needless to say, I absolutely didn't want to work by myself either. The only one of us who seemed unaffected was M, the most skeptical of all the staff. M would literally burst out laughing and make fun of us when we spoke about things happening. It's an old building. Things settle. The walls are soft. Someone with a spare key is pulling a prank on y'all, etc. She didn't believe anything and thought that we were all collectively freaking ourselves out. And I think that her dismissal angered or bothered whatever was haunting our store, and it may have explained some of the escalation of events. The entity got more aggressive and started literally breaking things. We'd come to work to find things shattered and stuff would hurtle off the walls and come crashing down beside us. We'd hear furniture rattle in the back store and played rock, paper, scissors to find out who would have to go in there to turn off the light breakers in there at night. I was so terrified that whenever it was my turn to close the store, I begged my boyfriend at the time to come pick me up so I wouldn't have to close up alone. One time, I even got locked inside during my shift. I was searching for a box when the door slammed shut behind me. The key, which I was sure I'd brought with me, was nowhere to be found. Fortunately, my manager, Jay, was nearby with the spare key to let me out. It had happened to her before as well as to E. We were all on edge except for, and that is, until one morning. I arrived at work to find and had gotten there early to relax and eat breakfast. But when I walked in, she was standing at the back of the store, looking visibly shaken. I asked what was going on, and she told me that when she arrived, the store had that heavy, oppressive atmosphere, like the place was filled with bad energy. She tried to shake it off, but she just couldn't shake the feeling. She felt watched, and it made her extremely uncomfortable. What freaked her out the most was that she could physically feel it. Unfortunately for her, that feeling never really left. So, she ended up quitting in late summer. She had been on edge every time she worked, not feeling like herself, and eventually told us she felt like she might go crazy if she stayed. Needless to say, that didn't make us feel any better. Our staff was quitting en masse, we were all scared to work, and we kept seeing strange things in mirrors. Even my manager, who was notoriously spiritually insensitive, admitted she was starting to feel like she was losing her mind. Things continued to get stranger and more intense all throughout the summer and into the fall, and even customers noticed the weird vibe. One woman, in particular, refused to enter the store, saying there was something inside that didn't want us there. Honestly, that freaked me out so much. I felt uneasy and jumpy for the rest of the day, and it carried on into my nights. I had nightmares, and my sleep was a nightmare in itself. I was juggling full-time university and full-time work, and I was absolutely drained. By the time winter came around, I was ready to quit. Christmas came and went, and then the town became really quiet. We live in a harsh, snowy winter climate, and most of our clientele were summer tourists, so after December, business completely died until March. So, I spent entire days alone at the store with only 1 or 2 clients during my shift. It was awful. I was just waiting to land another job so I could quit, but then something happened that was the final straw. On a particularly miserable February day, I headed into work, knowing full well that I probably wouldn't see a single customer. The weather was dark, gray, and snowing heavily, with fierce winds, a full-on storm. Honestly, I wondered why I even bothered showing up. It would have been smarter to just close that day, but my manager was working with me and I decided that I didn't want to leave her alone. So I get to the store and it's dark and gloomy in there, and my manager is there already kind of throwing a fit. Apparently, when she looked at herself in the mirror when she'd gotten there earlier, she felt like she wasn't looking at herself. It's hard to explain, but she had the distinct feeling that it wasn't her in the mirror staring back. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I kind of understood what she meant. She kind of lost it at this point and started just yelling at whatever was there to leave us and to stop messing with us. It had basically just happened as I arrived, and for the rest of the day, we were both jumpy and on edge. Of course, there wasn't a single client, and it was mid-afternoon, dark outside because the sun sets early in the winter, so it was dark indoors too, and it was just plain miserable. We were sitting in the middle of the store where there was a decorative couch that we actually used all the time and lacing a big pile of bodies that we'd gotten earlier that week when we heard one of the tables in the back of the store rattling. When my manager went to check, she called me over, and an entire display of little leather pouches that had been painstakingly arranged on the table had been just tossed right off. Little pouches were everywhere, and the table was askew, and there were long scratches that had been gouged into the surface. Not deep by any means, but they were definitely there, and obviously we freaked the fuck out at this. And that's when my manager noticed the mannequins in the back display window. They were facing inside the store and not out as they should have been. She asked me if I had moved them today, and obviously I hadn't. The only time that we would actually move those was when we changed their clothes. No one could have possibly moved them since the only door to the store was all the way at the opposite end. I then noticed that every single mannequin in the store was actually turned towards us, including the ones in the front display window. How or when that happened, I'll never know. I mean, I still have no explanation to this day. If it was a prank, it was so well orchestrated that I wonder what kind of mastermind had this much time to waste scaring the fuck out of a little team of hapless teenagers and young adults just trying to get by. I mean, my hands are shaking even talking about this. But to this day, it's definitely one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. Realizing that all the mannequins have been turned towards us, it gave me a heart attack. I still get major shivers whenever I tell people about this experience too. I felt watched and so unsafe that it was horrifying. My body was in fight or flight mode and I felt physically ill. I had to get out of there, and not a minute too soon too. And that's pretty much when I decided that it was enough. I pretty much told my manager, okay, that's it. I've had enough and I'm leaving this place and never coming back. Fuck this. I'm going home. She didn't want to stick around either, so we just grabbed all our shit and left right there, and then didn't turn off the breakers. Didn't do any closing procedure. We just got our shit, put the key in the door, and hightail it out of there. And after that day, I never went back. But the owners decided to close for the remainder of the winter the week after that, and we all got an unemployment benefit until we found new jobs, and when they opened again in April or something, I told my supervisor when he called me offering me a job that I'd rather literally die than set foot in that store again. I walk in the front of the old building a few times a year when my errands take me to the old part of town. They closed the store permanently a few years ago, and to this day it remains vacant. I ran into the barmaids and waiters that worked upstairs a few times. We'd often chat on our respective porches when we got out to smoke back when I worked there. Last summer, I was walking on the street below the shop and ran into one of the barmaids. We started catching up, and she was telling me how our old store was still vacant and that whoever visited it, the two opened something in it, would back out of it last minute or change their minds. I decided to bite the bullet and ask her if anything strange or uncanny had ever happened in the bar at the risk of looking a little strange, and she looked at me with big eyes and nodded. She said all the time, the chairs flying, bottles shattering, barmaids and waiters hearing weird sounds at night, doors closing of their own volition, and a plethora of others. We exchanged stories for a good hour after that. I'm quite convinced that that entire building is haunted or something, and honestly, it wouldn't surprise me in the least in that part of town where most of the buildings are 200 plus years old. I never quite knew what it was that was there, what its motivations were, but one thing was for sure, it definitely did not want us there. Let me mention that I'm kind of a scientist at heart. I would never label myself a skeptic by any means, but I do love a good logical scientific explanation. If I could have debunked any of the events I mentioned, I would have gladly done it, but there are no words and not a single explanation that I could possibly have for that horror and the sense of dread and the events that unfolded where I worked there. And even now, nearly 10 years later, you could never pay me enough to set foot back in there. Not in a 1,000,000 years. The moment I stumbled upon the first makeshift grave, I knew my peaceful hiking trip had turned into a nightmare. The forest floor was unnaturally disturbed, with grotesque mounds scattered across the landscape like chilling landmarks. As I stood there, frozen in horror, one thought echoed through my mind. I had just walked into a serial killer's dumping ground, and I needed to get out before I became the next victim. My name's Alex, and I've always been an avid hiker. There's something about losing myself in nature that clears my head and helps me put things in perspective. So when I had a few days off work, I decided to tackle a new trail in the Cascade Mountains. One that was off the beaten path and promised solitude along with breathtaking views. The first day of my hike was everything I'd hoped for. The trail was challenging yet rewarding, winding through dense forests and opening up to stunning vistas of snow-capped peaks. I set up camp that night feeling accomplished and at peace, eager to see what the next day would bring. I broke camp early the next morning, eager to cover more ground. The trail became less defined as I pushed deeper into the wilderness, but I wasn't concerned. I had my GPS and plenty of experience navigating rough terrain. It was late afternoon when things took a turn. I had veered slightly off the main trail, following what looked like a game path in search of a good spot to camp for the night. That's when I saw it. A patch of ground that looked wrong. The earth was mounded in an unnatural way, and withered flowers were scattered on top. Curiosity overtook my caution as I approached the mound, my heart pounding. As I drew closer, I saw more unsettling details. Fabric peeking through the dirt and what looked disturbingly like strands of hair. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This was a grave, a fresh one, and it wasn't the only one. As I scanned the area, I saw other mounds scattered around, some older, more overgrown than others. Panic surged through me. I needed to get out of there to contact the authorities. But just as I turned to leave, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I froze, straining my ears. Could have been an animal, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept toward a large boulder, hoping to use it for cover. I had just ducked behind it when I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming closer. "I know you're out there," a voice called out, calm and unervingly friendly. "No use hiding. Why don't you come out so we can talk?" I held my breath, pressing myself tightly against the cold stone of the boulder. My mind raced. Should I make a run for it? Try to reason with him? I had no weapon. Nothing to defend myself with except my wits. "Fuck. Come on now," the voice continued, closer now. "I promise I won't hurt you. I just want to explain." Yeah, right. I'd seen enough crime shows to know exactly how this would go. He'd try to lure me out, to get me to trust him, and then I'd end up in one of those shallow graves. I peered around the edge of the boulder, trying to get a glimpse of my stalker. What I saw made my blood run cold. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in hunting gear, and he was carrying a rifle. In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't outrun a bullet, but maybe I could outsmart him. I grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it as hard as I could in the opposite direction. The sound of it crashing through the underbrush had the desired effect. The man whirled towards the noise, his rifle raised. "I see you," he shouted, starting to move away from me. I took my chance. I burst from my hiding spot and ran, not caring about the noise I was making. I could hear him cursing behind me, then the sound of pursuit. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen logs. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I didn't slow down. I could hear him behind me getting closer. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like lead, but terror kept me going. I had no idea where I was running to, only that I needed to get away. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling and bouncing painfully before coming to a stop at the bottom. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and winded. The sound of sliding rocks above me snapped me back to reality. He was coming down after me. Ignoring the pain radiating through my body, I forced myself to my feet and started running again. The forest was denser here, the undergrowth thicker. It slowed me down, but it would slow him down too. I pushed through, ignoring the thorns that tore at my clothes and skin. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning, but eventually, I burst out of the tree line and found myself on a road, an actual paved road. Hope surged through me. Where there was a road, there had to be people. Civilization. Safety. I turned in what I hoped was the direction of the nearest town and started running again. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see my pursuer emerging from the trees. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw headlights approaching. I waved my arms frantically, praying the driver would stop. The car, an old pickup truck, slowed to a stop beside me. An elderly man peered out at me, his face creased with concern. "You all right, miss?" he asked. "Please," I gasped, fighting to catch my breath. "I need help. There's a man. He's after me. Please, can you take me to the police?" The old man's eyes widened, but he nodded, reaching over to unlock the passenger door. "Get in," he said. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see the killer standing in the middle of the road, watching us drive away. But there was nothing but empty asphalt stretching behind us. The rest of the night was a blur of police statements and medical checks. I told them everything about the graves, the chase, the terror of thinking I was going to die out there in the wilderness. They found the site I described, uncovering multiple bodies in various states of decomposition. They told me, the work of a serial killer who had been active in the area for years. They never caught him, though. He vanished into the vast wilderness, leaving behind only his grisly handiwork and the nightmares of those who encountered him. I don't go hiking alone anymore. Can't bring myself to it, not after what happened. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude for me, now feels full of hidden dangers. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth sets my heart racing. But I haven't given up on nature entirely. These days, I stick to popular trails, always with a group, and I've become an advocate for hiker safety, sharing my story as a cautionary tale. Because the truth is, the wilderness can be dangerous in ways we don't always consider. It's not just the terrain or the wildlife we need to be wary of. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators out there are the ones that walk on two legs. I often think about that day, about how close I came to becoming just another victim, another body in a shallow grave. It's a sobering thought, but also a reminder of my own strength and resilience. I survived. I outsmarted a killer and lived to tell the tale. And while the experience left its scars, both physical and emotional, it also taught me something important. Life is precious, and every moment is a gift. I don't take anything for granted anymore. Each sunrise, each breath, each step on a trail, they're all reminders that I'm alive, that I made it out of those woods when others didn't. So I keep walking, keep exploring, always with one eye on the path ahead and the other watching my back. Because you never know what's lurking just beyond the next bend in the trail. The asylum had trapped us in some kind of shared hallucination, feeding off our fear. But if I could break free, wake up, I told myself, concentrating with every ounce of my being. This isn't real. Wake up. The world around me shattered. I felt a sensation of falling, and then, I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the floor of the asylum's entrance hall. My friends were there too, groggily sitting up and looking around, just as confused as I was. The building was still there, old, creepy, yes, but it was just a building, not the living nightmare we'd experienced. We didn't speak as we stumbled out into the cool night air. There would be time later to try to make sense of what had happened. For now, we were just relieved to be alive, to be free. As we drove away, I glanced back at Ravenscroft Asylum one last time. In an upper window, I thought I saw a face watching us leave. A face that smiled, its teeth too many, too sharp, before it melted back into the shadows. I shuddered and turned away. We had escaped this time, but deep down, I knew the asylum would be waiting for its next victims. After all, a place like that is always hungry for more. The first crack of thunder made us all jump, our nervous laughter barely masking the growing unease that had settled over our group. We'd been driving for hours, searching for a motel when the storm hit with a vengeance. That's when we saw it. A looming, abandoned house, its windows dark and shuttered. Little did we know, seeking shelter there would turn out to be the worst decision of our lives. "Come on, guys," Mike said, his voice forced with cheerfulness. "It's just for one night. Better than sleeping in the car." I wasn't so sure about that, but as another flash of lightning illuminated the torrential downpour outside, I realized we didn't have much choice. There were 4 of us: Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, our friend Jake, and me. We'd been on a road trip to a music festival when our GPS led us astray, guiding us down increasingly remote back roads. We grabbed our bags and made a mad dash for the house, the rain soaking us through within seconds. The front door was unlocked, swinging open with an ominous creak that sent a shiver down my spine. The interior was musty and dark, years of neglect evident in the thick layer of dust on every surface. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and furniture draped in yellowed sheets. "This place is creepy as hell," Jake muttered, voicing the thought we all shared. Sarah, always the practical one, started pulling the sheets off the furniture. "Let's just try to make it comfortable for the night. We'll leave first thing in the morning." We set up camp in what must have once been the living room. Mike got a fire going in the old fireplace, the warmth and light helping to ease the oppressive atmosphere of the house. As we huddled around the fire, drying our clothes and sharing the meager snacks we had left, I almost started to feel okay about our situation. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car engine, growing louder as it approached the house. We froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Who else would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, on a night like this? "Maybe it's the owners," Sarah whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her doubt. The car stopped outside, its headlights casting long shadows through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. We heard car doors slam, followed by low, urgent voices, men's voices. Mike quickly doused the fire, plunging us into darkness. We huddled together, hardly daring to breathe, as footsteps approached the front door. The door burst open, and 3 men entered, their hulking silhouettes filling the doorway. They were carrying something, large duffel bags that clinked metallically as they moved. "Coast is clear," one of them growled. "Let's get this stuff hidden and get out of here." They moved further into the house, apparently heading for the back rooms. As soon as they were out of sight, Mike grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here," he hissed. "Now." But as we started to gather our things, we heard the men returning. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were trapped. The beam of a flashlight swept across the room, catching us in its glare. For a moment, everyone froze. "What the hell?" one of the men shouted. "Who are you?" Mike stepped forward, his hands raised placatingly. "We're just travelers. Got caught in the storm. We didn't mean to intrude." He was cut off by the sound of a gun being cocked. "Shut up," the man snarled. "You shouldn't be here." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, hear Jake's ragged breathing. Look, Mike tried again, his voice admirably steady. We don't want any trouble. We'll leave right now and forget we ever saw you. The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, the one who seemed to be in charge spoke. Can't let you do that, he said, his voice cold, and you've seen too much. It was at that moment that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the duffel bags had fallen open, spilling its contents onto the floor. Even in the dim light, I could see the glint of gold bars. We'd stumbled into the aftermath of a heist. What followed was a nightmare of fear and tension. The men, who we came to know as Vince, Eddie, and Carl, held us at gunpoint while they argued about what to do with us. It became clear that Vince, the leader, was in favor of permanent solutions, while Eddie seemed reluctant to add murder to their list of crimes. They tied us up and locked us in one of the back rooms, a musty old bedroom with a single rain-lashed window. As soon as the door closed behind them, we started working on our bonds. We need to get out of here, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. They're going to kill us. We don't know that, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Maybe they'll just leave us here. Jake snorted. Yeah, right. You heard them. We're loose ends. I couldn't argue with that. The reality of our situation was starting to sink in, and panic clawed at my throat. We were miles from anywhere in the middle of a storm, being held captive by armed robbers who were discussing whether or not to kill us. It was like something out of a bad movie, except this was terrifyingly real. Hours passed, marked only by the occasional rumble of thunder and the hushed voices of our captors filtering through the thin walls. We took turns working at our bonds, our wrists raw and bleeding from the effort. It was nearly dawn when I finally felt my ropes give way. Moving as quietly as I could, I untied the others. We were free, but we were far from safe. What's the plan? Jake whispered, rubbing his chafed wrists. I peered out the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, misty morning. We make a run for it, I said, the cars still out front. If we can reach it, I was cut off by the sound of approaching footsteps. We barely had time to resume our positions, pretending to still be tied up, before the door swung open. It was Eddie, alone. He looked pale and nervous, his eyes darting around the room. Listen, he said, his voice low and urgent. I'm not like them. I never signed up for this. I'm going to help you get out of here. We exchanged skeptical glances. Could we trust him? Did we have a choice? Eddie quickly untied our fake bonds, speaking in hushed tones, explaining that Vince and Carl were asleep. We had a small window of opportunity to escape. We crept through the house, every creaking floorboard making my nerves tighten. As we neared the front door, I started to believe we might actually make it. That's when everything went to hell. A floorboard groaned loudly under Jake's foot, and we heard a shout from upstairs. Gunshots rang out, splintering the wood around us as we bolted for the door. We burst into the night, sprinting for our car. I could hear Vince and Carl behind us, their curses mixed with the sound of their guns firing. I dove into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The others piled in, screaming at me to go, go, go. The engine roared to life just as Vince and Carl emerged from the house, guns blazing. I floored it, gravel spraying as we fishtailed onto the road. Bullets pinged off the car, the back window shattering in a storm of glass. Sarah was screaming, Jake was yelling directions, and Mike was twisted in his seat, watching for any sign of pursuit. We drove for what felt like hours, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving us shaky and silent. It wasn't until we reached the highway and merged with early morning traffic that we finally started to believe we'd made it. We went straight to the police and gave our statements, described the men and the house. They found the place, but it was empty. No gold, no robbers, not even Eddie. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of gunshots echoing in my ears. I see the glint of gold bars, feel the rough ropes on my wrists, hear Vince's cold voice as he discussed our fate. We went looking for shelter from a storm and found ourselves fighting for our lives. It's strange how quickly the world can turn upside down, how a wrong turn can lead you into a nightmare. I don't take road trips anymore, and I never, ever seek shelter in abandoned houses. I've shared a terrifying experience in Chicago before, but what happened yesterday completely outdid that moment of fear in the big city. Thankfully, it turned out to be a misunderstanding, and there was no actual danger. But it really opened my eyes to the fact that even if you think you're immune to situations like this, you're not. I used to think that way too. What happened yesterday is still fresh in my mind. I was with my friend and her husband, and we had just walked into the mall after getting our nails done. We had exited the store we parked in front of and entered the hallway when we immediately noticed that something was off. People looked unsettled, and a few were rushing past us, clearly trying to get to the exit as fast as possible. We stood there for a second, confused about what was happening. My friend noticed it first. There were two people in a huge fight. And I mean huge. They were slamming each other to the ground, WWE style. It felt like we were frozen, standing there for an eternity. But in reality, it was only a few seconds before someone shouted, "Gun!" That's when panic set in. It was like a scene from a movie playing out. And I just stood there, thinking, is this really happening? A woman rushed past me with a little girl in her arms, covering her body around the child like she was trying to shield her from something. Without thinking, we bolted out of there. It was chaotic. People yelling, running, and stampeding around us. I couldn't help but brace myself, waiting for gunshots to ring out. My friend's husband stopped for a moment, and I could hear my friend screaming his name, telling him to move. I slowed down a bit so I wouldn't lose her, but honestly, I didn't want to be shot either. Part of me felt guilty for instinctively wanting to save myself, but my brain was screaming at me to stop and wait for my friend. I slowed my pace, called her name, and thankfully, she and her husband caught up to me. We finally made it back to the car, completely out of breath, having run like that for the first time since high school. We stood by the car for a while, debating what to do next. Eventually, we decided to get drinks at a restaurant across the parking lot, so her husband could keep an eye on what was happening, since the police had just arrived. Suddenly, my friend's husband turned to us with a serious look and said, "Go." We all got nervous again and asked, "Why?" He just kept saying, "Go, go, go," and hurriedly started ushering us away. It wasn't until we were walking faster that we finally got an answer. He said he either heard something drop or a gunshot. That's when the fear really kicked in. It didn't take long for the confusion to clear up, though. We learned that it was actually a misunderstanding. The police showed up, the mall shut down temporarily, and we watched it all unfold from the bar in the restaurant. After a little while, the police left, and the mall reopened like nothing had happened. When we looked up news articles later, it turned out that the pop sound my friend's husband and others had mistaken for a gunshot was actually someone's car running over a pop bottle that burst, creating a sound similar to a gunshot. It was all just a mix-up. Thankfully, no one got hurt, aside from the two guys who were fighting like they were in a boxing ring. And we still don't know who called out gun or why. I never thought something like this would happen to me, but clearly, it can. You always think you'll be safe, and when something happens, you just hear about it on the news and say, "Wow, so glad I wasn't there." But now I realize how quickly things can change. When I bought the house, the real estate agent failed to mention the stairs. It was an old home, built sometime in the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors and a wraparound porch. The place had character, and I was eager to restore it. But from the very first night, something felt off. The problem was the staircase. Every time I climbed it, no matter how light my steps, the third stair would creak. A single, sharp groan that echoed through the house. It was strange because the other stairs were silent. Even when I deliberately put my full weight on them, they didn't make a sound. But the third stair always, without fail, creaked. And then, one night, it spoke. I was coming up from the kitchen, a glass of water in hand, when I stepped on it. The familiar creak filled the air. But this time, it wasn't just wood shifting. It was a whisper, low, barely audible, slithering through the air like a breath pressed against my ear. Don't look back. My body locked up, my foot still planted on the stair. My breath hitched in my throat. I stood frozen, listening, waiting, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Then I felt it. Presence. Standing just behind me. I didn't turn around. I forced myself to move forward, climbing the rest of the stairs without looking back. My heart pounded as I reached my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to recreate it. I stepped on the third stair over and over, testing different angles, different amounts of pressure. Nothing happened, just the same creak. I almost laughed at myself. It had to have been my imagination. Then, as I turned to go back down, the whisper returned. I see you. The glass in my hand shattered on the floor. I didn't go back downstairs that night. I started avoiding the staircase, using the back entrance to get in and out of the house. But the whispers followed. I would hear them in the quiet spaces, between breaths, just beneath the hum of the refrigerator. Muted words, fragmented phrases, seeping through the walls like smoke. And always the third stair would creak, even when I wasn't near it. Even when I was upstairs, locked in my bedroom, trying to drown out the sound with music. Then, one night, I woke up to footsteps, slow, heavy, climbing the stairs. My chest tightened as I pulled the covers over my head, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. And then, a whisper, low, insistent, "Open the door." I didn't. I stayed in bed, my body trembling, until morning light seeped through the curtains. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, my stomach turned to ice. The third stair was wet, like something had been standing there, waiting. That day, I called a carpenter, desperate for an explanation. He arrived in the afternoon, a burly man with calloused hands, and knocked on the stair with his knuckles. "It's hollow," he muttered. "That's strange. Let me check something." I watched as he pulled a small crowbar from his bag, wedging it under the third stair. He pried it up with a grunt, revealing a dark, empty space beneath, and something inside it, a bundle of old, yellowed cloth, a small, brittle bone, a child's shoe. My breath left me in a shuddering exhale. The carpenter went pale, dropping the stair plank as he backed away. "You need to leave," he said. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop outside my door. They came inside. This happened back in college around 7 years ago. At the time, I was living with one of my best friends, and we were both really into the bar scene and partying. We lived in a college town, so there were always parties happening. And admittedly, I was out partying almost every other night. This story starts on a typical night for us. We got dressed up and went on a bar crawl, eventually ending up at this popular club. It was one of the bigger spots in town, and we met up with my ex-roommate there. The three of us were having a great time, but there was this one guy who kept popping up in our conversations. We never remembered his name, but he seemed pretty normal. He joined us on the smoking porch, bummed a cigarette off me, bought my friend a drink, and danced near us. We even had a short conversation with him, although I can't recall what it was about. But he was around us all night, lingering at the edges. Around 1 a.m., the three of us decided we were drunk enough and done with dancing. My ex-roommate invited me and my best friend to her place to smoke. We didn't have cars, but it was a nice night, and her place was only a couple of miles away. So we started walking. The downtown area quickly turned into a mix of residential and warehouse spaces. It wasn't the best part of town, but it wasn't bad either. Usually, the streets were empty. About halfway to her house, we noticed someone behind us, getting closer. We didn't think much of it at first, but when we stopped to light up, he caught up with us. It was the guy from the bar. He was stumbling, clearly drunk, and greeted us like we were old friends. We didn't want to be rude, but it was a little strange that he was there. Still, we figured he was just drunk and harmless. I should mention that he was tall and very thin, with a baby face and wide eyes. He looked harmless, just drunk. He asked if he could bum a smoke and walk with us for a bit until he got to wherever he was going. He was visibly unsteady on his feet, so we shrugged and said, "Sure, why not?" We kept walking and chatting, but he never indicated where he was headed. Eventually, I asked him, "Where do you live, anyway?" He gave me this odd look, as if I'd asked a dumb question, then said, "Oh, I don't live anywhere near here." That made us all feel uncomfortable, and we stopped walking. I asked him, "Well, where are you going then?" He replied, "Oh, I'm following you." At that point, I thought maybe there had been some kind of misunderstanding on his part. I responded with something like, "Okay, well, no offense, but we don't even know your name, so you're not coming with us." His expression shifted, like he was hurt, but also angry and a little manic. He raised his voice and said, "But I told you all my name. I told each of you my name. How do none of you remember my name?" At this point, my ex-roommate steps in and says, "Look, man, I know you're drunk, but you really need to calm down." And the guy stops and gets real calm, real fast, and he gets this really serious look and says, "No, I'm not drunk. I'm fine. I just knew you'd trust me more if you thought I was drunk." At that point, I'm like, "No, I'm out." But my roommate doesn't believe him and says something like, "You've been stumbling this whole time. Of course, you're drunk." And he shakes his head, and in a completely calm tone with no slurring whatsoever, he goes, "No, I'm sober. I just wanted to see if you'd let me in your house." And my friend responds, "Why?" And the guy gets this huge smile and his big eyes get even wider and he says, "I just wanted to see how close I could get to killing you." At that point, I'd had enough and I put on my authority voice and I told him that that is enough and that we're leaving and he needs to go the other direction now before I call the cops. He just shrugs and says, "Fine." And we scurry away and leave him leaning up against a stop sign, just smoking a cig and watching us go. As soon as we are around the corner, we all break into a dead sprint and run for a few blocks and then stop and freak out. We are in the middle of a panic whisper huddle when my friend looks over my shoulder and lets out this little scream. We turn around and there he is. It's dark so we can't really see his face, just his silhouette against the street lamps. But it was enough to know it was definitely him. He is striding down the road a few blocks down, hands in his pockets, not a trace of a stumble. And he's not exactly running, but he's walking at this real brisk pace. And he had been on us in less than a minute. Luckily, we're only about a block away from my friend's place, so we start booking it there. We're almost at the front door when I realize, oh, crap, we don't want him to know where we're going. Not the three of us alone. That seems dangerous. Fortune shines on us as up the block. I can see the telltale signs of a garage party and we book it over there instead. We come up to the lawn and there's a bunch of guys out front and we are breathlessly trying to explain ourselves. But when we turn around to point out the guy, he's gone. The partiers sympathize and let us hang out for a few hours and a few of them even walked us back to the house. Thankfully, we never saw the guy again. And needless to say, my friends and I lost our taste for partying for quite a while after that. Let me start by saying that I live in a small regional town in Australia. There's no trafficking, no gang violence, no unsolved murders or missing persons. Basically, nothing like that happens here. Just to give you a sense of the kind of place I live in, this happened today, and I'm still uncertain about whether I should take any action or if the police would even care. For context, I flip furniture as a hobby. I enjoy picking up old, worn-out pieces, fixing them up, repainting them, and then reselling them. It's a good way to keep my mind occupied. Facebook Marketplace is usually where I find things. So this morning, I saw an ad for a free table. I messaged the seller, asking if I could pick it up today. As I was typing the message, I noticed their profile picture disappeared. I thought it was strange, but maybe they just changed it. They agreed to a time and sent me the address. No big deal. It was on the edge of town. Then, they sent me a strange message asking if I was coming alone or if I would have someone with me. I'm not married or anything, and the question set off a ton of red flags. But I figured maybe the table was heavy, and they just wanted to make sure I had help. I replied saying, "No, it's fine. I'll be okay on my own." After that, I didn't hear back from them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I've never felt like this before, and I didn't know why I was suddenly so uneasy. But it was midday, I had my phone, I was driving, and this is a safe town. Maybe I was just overthinking things. So I decided to go anyway. I typed the address into my GPS, but it couldn't locate it, which I thought was strange. However, I managed to find the street. But when I got there was nothing. Just a creek running alongside it. Empty lots with overgrown grass and bushland. A rundown, isolated motel, and 3 warehouses. At that point, I felt really unsettled. Everything inside me was telling me something was seriously wrong. I tried to push through it, but the feeling kept growing. 2 of the warehouses had no signs, though I could see cars parked in front, so I figured they were businesses of some sort. But none of them matched the address I'd been given. Even though the motel looked like it hadn't been used in years, I saw a man sitting on the steps of one of the units, smoking. I thought it was a bit strange, but I told myself maybe he was the owner doing some work, or maybe he was just a squatter. Either way, it was off, but I tried to ignore it. I drove a little further down the street and eventually found the last warehouse. The address matched where I was supposed to pick up the table, so I figured this was the place. But as I looked around, I started thinking maybe they gave me the wrong number. The area was surrounded by tall weeds, garbage piled up out front, and the whole place looked abandoned. It seemed like it hadn't been used in years. I may like free furniture, but I'm not stupid. I decided I didn't want the table anymore, so I sent the guy a message saying I couldn't find the place. He replied almost immediately, asking if I was the one in the truck. He mentioned that he saw me drive down the road and then asked again if I was alone. There were no cars, no sign of life at the warehouse, and by now my gut was screaming at me to leave. I was in a truck, but I hadn't seen a soul. I replied saying, "Yes, sorry, I couldn't find the place. I'm leaving." Then there was silence for about an hour. No apology, no response at all. Then, finally, I got another message. "It's the old motel. You have to get out of your car and walk to the back of it to get reception." It was the same motel, run down, overgrown, and clearly unused for years. The same one with the creepy guy sitting on the steps. I immediately thought he was the one messaging me. I sent back, "That motel looks like it hasn't been used in years." Again, no response. I decided to head home, have a drink, and Google the place again. But when I went to search for the address, I realized I'd forgotten the exact one. So I went back to Messenger to find it, but it was gone. The entire conversation was wiped out. Then I checked Facebook Marketplace. The whole ad had vanished. It was as if it never existed at all. So now I'm left wondering, am I just overthinking this? Or did I narrowly avoid something sinister? This happened on Halloween night years ago in the wine country of California. My 2 roommates and I lived in a 3-bedroom, 2-story house. Early in the evening, everything was normal. We handed out candy to trick-or-treaters, hung out together, watched a scary movie, and overall, we were having a great time. Halloween always has that eerie feeling, especially when you're staying home. You never really expect anything truly sinister to happen. After the candy was all handed out and the kids had gone, our movie was winding down. We had all drunk some wine, and by midnight, we were getting pretty sleepy. We decided to call it a night and head to our separate rooms. I slept in the bedroom on the first floor, while my roommates had the 2 bedrooms upstairs. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a noise and an overwhelming, bad feeling. I got out of bed and stood in my dark room, straining to hear the noise that had disturbed me. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just my imagination and I had gotten up for no reason. But then, I heard it. A muffled scream coming from upstairs. I heard scuffling and commotion. My heart raced with fear, and I knew I had to go see what was happening. But in moments like these, you know deep down that fear wants to take over. You want to hide, to escape, to be anywhere but where danger might be. But still, I opened my bedroom door, stepping out into the darkness. The stairs were just a few feet away from my door. As soon as I took those steps, I heard fast, Heavy footsteps coming down the hall from the top of the stairs. Whoever it was coming right toward me. It was pitch black, and I had only a split second to decide what to do. My body moved on its own, silently and quickly, to the back sliding glass door. I opened it as quietly as I could. I felt like someone was right behind me, about to grab me, but no one did. I stepped backward into the bushes of my backyard, my eyes still on the open door, expecting any moment for someone to come out and see me. But no one did. I waited in the bushes for what felt like 3 minutes, my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified of what had just happened in the house, unsure of what was still going on. I didn't want to go back in. But then, the faces of my 2 roommates flashed in my mind. I remembered earlier in the night, laughing and drinking with them, and it hit me. If they were in trouble, I had to be brave. I needed to go back inside to help them, so I did. I slowly walked back towards the back door, and I crept back inside, and I immediately heard screaming. This sounded like it was being muffled by blood. I heard gurgling noises. My heart was beating out of my chest as I climbed the stairs, unsure if somebody was still in my house or if they had gone. I came to my first roommate's bedroom and turned on the light. A very surreal feeling of this cannot be happening swept over me as I gazed at both of my roommates lying on the bed. One was silent. One was groaning in pain. There was blood all over the room. I did not know what to do. One of them was making noises and the other was very clearly dead. I stepped into the room and almost slipped on the actual puddle of blood that was there on the ground. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I was in shock. I grabbed my roommate's phone off her nightstand and dialed 911. I felt as if the intruder was still in the house and was going to approach me from behind. I kept turning around. I saw nothing. I told the operator that I needed an ambulance immediately and that my friends were dying. Ambulances and police were at my house in only a few minutes. My friend that was groaning, she died before the police arrived, and I never saw the intruder. For some reason, he skipped my bedroom that night and instead went upstairs to murder both of my friends. The nightmare I'm about to share plagued me from age 6 to 9. I didn't realize it was more than just a nightmare until 2 weeks ago. When I was 6, my mother and I moved into an older home. It was in good condition for the most part. Just a 1-story house with a sunroom, a nice backyard, an attic, and unfortunately, a basement. The house had 2 bedrooms, so after my baby sister was born, we ended up sharing a room. Not long after we moved in, I began having the same disturbing nightmare repeatedly. In it, I would be lying in bed when a man would enter my room, grab me by the leg, and start dragging me off the bed and onto the floor. As he dragged me toward the basement staircase, he would pause at the top before continuing down the stairs. I would scream, but he never stopped. The basement was all white walls, white tile flooring. There was an old vintage dentist chair, and he would force me into it. While he strapped me down with restraints on my wrists, ankles, and forehead, I finally got a good look at him. He wore all white, a long lab coat with a round silver thing on his forehead. The only thing that wasn't white were his dark brown dress shoes. He was an older man with white facial hair. There was a long white table covered in jars filled with teeth, the gums still attached. He had an empty jar and a set of tools laid out. He grabbed a knife and began cutting into my gums. Blood poured everywhere as I screamed. The dream always ended just before I felt like I was going to die. I never watched scary movies as a child, so my mother couldn't figure out why I kept having this nightmare. I would wake up in tears, wondering why it kept happening. When I was 9, we moved because my mother remarried, and I didn't have that nightmare again. Fast forward to 2 weeks ago. My husband and I were reminiscing about the homes we grew up in, and that's when I started thinking about the old house. I decided to look it up online and managed to find some history about it. I was fascinated until I came across a man who was very close to the family. Not only had he helped get electricity into the house, but he had also rented out the basement for a while. He was a man of science, a respected professor at a local university. He even shared my husband's last name, though they weren't related. I showed my husband a picture of him, and as soon as I saw his face, I screamed and quickly covered my mouth. My husband asked what was wrong, and I told him about the nightmare. I then said, "That's the man who would cut out my teeth." When I was younger, I spent many summers working on a camp staff as the pool director after being a Boy Scout for years. A fellow staff member named Chris and I arrived 2 weeks before the rest of the team to get the camp ready for the summer. Our job was to clean the pool, check the equipment, and get all the canoes and rowboats out of storage and prepped for use. The rest of the camp staff wouldn't show up until the following week. I should mention that before I worked on staff, I had spent about 10 years camping at this very camp, and nothing ever went wrong. This camp was huge, over 600 acres, and Chris and I knew it like the back of our hands. When you enter the camp, you drive up a long, 2-mile road leading to a large gravel parking lot. At the front of the lot, off to the right, stands a large lodge, and a gravel road branches off from there in 2 directions, straight ahead or to the right. If you go straight, you can drive toward the dining hall or continue past it, winding down a road that takes you past several campsites and 4 different cabins over a 3-mile stretch. This road eventually leads to the back winter entrance of the camp at the lake, where there are more cabins and a parking lot. There are plenty of trails scattered throughout the area that connect the various campsites and cabins. About 3/4 of the way down the road, there's an amphitheater surrounded by large cliffs with caves. The trails crisscross through these cliffs, winding up to the top of the camp. The dining hall is located about 100 yards from the lodge. On the edge of the parking area, about 75 yards downhill from the dining hall, there's a large swimming pool with showers and changing rooms. Another 100 yards further down the hill is a dense pine forest, where the staff campsite is situated. This area had several small ponds and large cabins, with a road leading back to the top of the camp. After spending the day working outside, Chris and I cleaned up and met his parents in the nearest town for dinner. It was a great evening, and we returned to the campsite around 9:30 p.m. As we walked down the road to the staff area, we decided to sleep in the staff tents we had already set up since the weather was warm. Out of nowhere, we heard a truck turn down the gravel road. Initially, we thought it might be the ranger coming to check on us since he knew we were there, but the truck didn't sound like his at all. Luckily, the cabin we were standing in front of was set back from the road, so we were hidden from view. We quickly ducked behind the cabin, made our way to the back entrance, unlocked the door, entered, and locked it behind us. We hadn't turned on any lights, but the windows were open. As we peered through the window, we saw 3 trucks parked, with 4 men standing in front of them. None of them were camp staff, nor had we ever seen them before. At first, we wondered if they might have a legitimate reason to be there. Then, one of the men said, "Where'd they go? I saw them come down here." That's when it hit me they were looking for us. The cabin was empty, so we knew if they came to the windows or doors, they would spot us. Thankfully, there was a storage room across from the bathroom at the opposite end of the cabin. It had a small door in the floor that led to a ladder going underneath the cabin, which was about 6 feet off the ground. If they tried to get in, we at least had an exit. We heard the people at the front and back entrance knocking on windows telling us to come out. We quietly crept down the ladder and moved slowly to the opposite end of the cabin, and we were able to slide out the end where a piece of the lattice was missing around the edge of the cabin. Once out, we had to quickly decide if we run up the road to our cars, which was about a half a mile away, and risk them catching up to us in their trucks, or turn and run down one of the many trails in that area. At least we had the advantage of knowing the place if they decided to run after us. We snuck out from under the cabin and began walking towards one of the trails that was about 50 yards from the cabin. About halfway there, someone screamed, "They're over there." We began running down one of the trails that we knew led to the middle of the camp where there were many campsites, cabins, and areas we could hide. We could see flashlights running behind us and on the trails next to us. We quickly jumped onto another trail that led up to the amphitheater, where there was a hidden trail that led to the top. We knew we would be safe there because we would be able to see anyone that was walking up the trail. We finally made it to the amphitheater and to the top of the cliffs where we stayed for what seemed like forever, but was only a few hours. We kept seeing flashlights off in the distance. Finally, the flashlights were moving towards the lake opposite where we were. We took the back trail, which took us around the far back side of the camp into the top where the lodge and dining hall were located. It took about 45 minutes to reach the top. We then slowly walked back to the staff camp so we could get our keys. The staff area was about 200 yards from the parking lot where my car was parked, which is a different lot next to the archery range, which had a separate exit. We ran to the car and drove out of there as fast as we could. We drove to the camp ranger's house, which was at the very edge of camp by the main road, and told him what happened. He called the local sheriff. When they arrived about 40 minutes later, they searched throughout the camp and never found anyone. We never did find out who it was. We also never had any trouble the rest of the summer. I worked there the next 2 summers without issues. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night. One of those calls that jolts you awake with an overwhelming, inexplicable sense of dread. I'm not even sure why I picked up, especially since I didn't recognize the number. But something about the relentless ringing made me feel like I had to. You know that feeling? Like it's not just a phone call, but something urgent, something you can't ignore. I wish I hadn't answered that night. I wish I'd just let it ring. The voice on the other end was faint, almost muffled, as though they were speaking from a distance or through a bad connection. It was hard to make out the words at first, but the tone was clear. They were terrified. Panic laced their voice, the kind that makes your skin crawl because you have no idea what's coming next. "Help me," they whispered. "Please help me." I sat up in bed, fully awake now, my heart racing. "Who is this?" I demanded, but there was no answer, just the soft crackle of static and the faint sound of heavy breathing. For a moment, I thought it might be a prank, but the fear in that voice felt too real. "Who is this?" I asked again, louder this time. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Maybe it was just a wrong number, I told myself. Maybe someone dialed the wrong person, realized their mistake, and hung up. But as I lay back down, the voice lingered in my mind. "Please help me." The next day, I tried to push the call out of my mind. It was probably nothing, just someone in distress who dialed the wrong number. But the voice, it stuck with me. There was something in the way they'd said, "Help me," felt like more than just fear, felt like desperation. Still, I convinced myself to leave it alone. A week passed with no strange calls, and I began to think maybe it had been a one-off incident. But then, late one night, it happened again. The phone rang, the same unknown number flashing on the screen. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered immediately. "Hello." Again, there was a long pause. The same crackling static. The same faint breathing on the other end. I felt that same dread, my pulse quickening as I waited for the voice. "Please, help me," they whispered, just like before. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want?" The line crackled, and for a moment I thought I heard something else in the background, like footsteps or maybe distant voices, but it was too faint to be sure. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Why would someone be calling me? A complete stranger, asking for help in the middle of the night. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice softer now, more cautious. This time there was an answer, barely more than a whisper. "I don't know. I'm trapped." A chill ran down my spine. "Trapped where? What do you mean?" "I can't. I don't know how long I've been here." The voice continued, their words disjointed, like they were struggling to stay focused. "It's dark. I'm scared." I glanced around my dark bedroom, the faint glow of the street light filtering through the blinds. The room felt colder suddenly, and my skin prickled with an uneasy tension. "Tell me where you are," I said again. "I can help you, but you need to tell me where you are." The voice didn't respond right away. There was a long stretch of silence, followed by another crackle of static. "Don't let it find me," they whispered. "Please don't let it find me." My heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? What's trying to find you?" But before I could get an answer, the line went dead again. This time, I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again, half expecting the voice to come back. But it didn't. I thought about calling the police, telling them about the strange calls. But what could I say? That someone was calling me, asking for help. It wasn't like I had any useful information to give them. No name, no location, nothing but a voice. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was this person? Why were they calling me? And what had they meant by "don't let it find me"? That evening, as the sun began to set, I felt the tension building in my chest again. I hadn't heard from the mysterious caller all day, but something told me it wasn't over. Sure enough, just after midnight, my phone rang. The same number. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the answer button. I didn't want to pick up, but something in me needed to know. I answered, "Please." The voice whispered, more urgent this time. "It's getting closer." My heart raced. Who is? What's getting closer? They're coming. The voice said, their words trembling. I can't see it, but I can hear it. It's been watching me. I don't have much time. Panic surged through me, but I tried to keep my voice calm. "Tell me where you are. I can help you." There was a brief pause, and then, in the softest whisper, they said, "I'm right here." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean? Right where?" "I'm with you." The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I instinctively glanced around the room. It was empty, just me sitting alone in my bedroom. But something about the way they'd said those words made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Where are you? You have to stop it." The voice continued, their words becoming more frantic. "It's close. This almost found me." I stood up, pacing around the room, my mind racing. "I don't understand. What do you want me to do?" "Don't let it in," they whispered, their voice shaking. "Don't let it." The line went dead again. I stood there, frozen in the middle of my bedroom, heart pounding in my chest, the phone still gripped in my hand. The silence around me felt overwhelming. I stared at the screen, waiting for the call to return, but it never did. And then I heard it, a faint sound, coming from somewhere just outside my apartment. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as I listened, the sound grew louder. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. I froze, my blood turning cold. The tapping was steady, persistent, and it was coming from the front door. I didn't move. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, each tap sending waves of fear through my body. I wanted to go to the door, to peer through the peephole and see who or what was on the other side. But deep down, I knew that wasn't a good idea. "Don't let it in." The words rang in my mind, over and over again. Whoever had been calling me had warned me. They'd told me not to let it find me, not to let it in. The knocking stopped. I waited. Every muscle in my body was tense, straining to hear any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just silence. Thick, suffocating, filling the apartment like a heavy, oppressive blanket. Couldn't sleep that night. I didn't want to. I sat in the corner of my room, phone still in my hand, waiting for it to ring again. But it never did. The calls stopped after that night. I never heard from the mysterious voice again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint tapping, like someone or something is knocking, waiting to be let in. And every time, I remember the voice's last words, "Don't let it in." This happened in 2015. I had moved to a small house the year before, far from my hometown, so I was still getting used to the area and hadn't met many people yet. I worked from home, which made it even harder to connect with anyone. Anyway, I had no plans for Christmas that year. My family was too far away, and I didn't have enough vacation time to visit, so this would be my first Christmas alone. On Christmas Eve, I stayed up working, thinking I'd get ahead on some tasks so I wouldn't have to worry about them the next day. I was working in the living room, listening to music, when I thought I heard something from outside. I took out one of my earbuds to listen, but didn't hear anything else. So I got up to check around. With the music on, it was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but I was pretty sure it was outside. I looked out the back window, saw nothing, then moved to the front window. Again, nothing. But when I looked out the front door, I noticed something odd. There were shoe prints in the snow on the porch. They led right up to my doorstep and then back to the driveway. There was nothing left on the porch, no mail or anything, just the shoe prints. It felt strange and made me anxious, not knowing why anyone would be walking up to my doorstep at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve. I locked the door and went back to work, then headed to bed soon after. Christmas morning felt odd, just like any other day. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down to watch TV. I spent the morning just watching shows and movies. I called my parents to wish them a Merry Christmas and talked to them for a bit, but that was about it. I thought about going out, but the wind was really strong, and it was too cold, so I stayed in for the day. By 6 p.m., I hadn't done much, so I made some dinner, planning on going to bed early. But then I heard something outside again, the sound of footsteps shuffling in the snow coming toward the front door. I stayed quiet, knowing nobody should be out there. After a few seconds, the footsteps faded, walking away from the house. I got up to check and found almost the same scene as the night before. No sign of anyone, just the footprints. After that, I forced myself to stay up a little longer. I kept my eyes open until around 10, but I must have fallen asleep on the couch. I remember feeling tired and trying to stay awake, but I ended up dozing off. When I woke up, the TV was still on, casting light around the dark room. I sat up, paused it, and then got up to head to my bedroom. But as I walked down the hallway, my eyes locked on my bedroom door. It was open, and I always kept it closed. I walked over, pushed it open wider, and turned on the light. Wet shoe prints were scattered around the floor, leading to and from the window. I was in complete shock. I quickly turned on the hallway light and saw more shoe prints leading toward the living room. I followed them, but they stopped right outside the living room, looking like they turned around after seeing me on the couch. The prints didn't go anywhere else in the house. The police did what they could, but honestly, they weren't much help. The theory is that the man had come by the previous 2 nights to check if I was home. After not getting a response, he likely thought I was away for the holidays. It's probable he only intended to rob me, but the whole situation is still extremely disturbing, especially since I was asleep at home when it happened. Whoever it was never came back. A few summers ago, I worked at a mall in Toledo, Ohio, a big city right by the west end of Lake Erie. At the time, I was really focused on saving money for an apartment, my first big purchase, so I wanted to work as much as I could. To make that happen, I got a job at the Great American Cookies shop in the mall's food court, a place that had been around longer than I could remember. To maximize my hours, I worked the night shift. For those who aren't familiar, many bakeries and coffee shops hire bakers to come in overnight to prepare pastries and treats for the morning. They typically arrive around 3 a.m. and bake for hours. That's exactly what I did. I spent hours making cookie cakes and baking cookies until the sun rose. Afterward, I stayed on even longer to earn a bit more. It was actually quite cozy, with the warmth of the oven, the peaceful quiet, and the ability to play my music or listen to podcasts as I worked. But it also made me a little on edge at times. The place was definitely haunted, and no one really knew why. One morning, as I was eating breakfast at my counter, I suddenly heard the sharp music from the carousel echo through the empty food court. To give you a better idea, our food court had a small play area on the far side from where I worked. It was filled with kiddie rides, all of which lit up and played music when activated by motion. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about the sound, but I knew for sure that no one should have been in the mall at that hour, and there was no way I could have triggered the motion sensor by myself. As someone who regularly listened to scary stories while working, I was equal parts excited and nervous to see what was going on. I turned on the oven and shut off the lights everywhere except my station, trying to focus on the other side of the dark food court. It was nearly pitch black beyond the dim lights above my work area, but I could see the carousel spinning slowly, making a creaking sound as it moved. It wasn't until another ride was activated that I saw something that really made my stomach drop. Lit up by the headlights of one of the race car-themed rides, I saw something standing behind the carousel, facing me. It was the unmistakable silhouette of a security guard, leaning around the central pillar of the ride. I was standing and leaning in the doorway, almost mirroring the guard's position, trying to stay hidden while watching. I kept staring, but as I did, the situation started to feel increasingly strange. If they were standing on a carousel, why weren't they spinning? If they were a security guard, why weren't they doing their rounds like they usually do during the day? And why were they sneaking around? I kept my eyes on them and quickly texted one of the security guards I knew, hoping to get some answers. They confirmed my suspicions. I was the only person scheduled to be in the mall. I glanced down at my phone to reread the text. It maybe took a second. The moment I felt my gaze drop, I stopped myself, but it was already too late. There was now something standing about 5 feet away from our counter right along the edge of my field of view. Fun fact about the counter of our shop: it's not tall. I, standing at 64, could essentially step over it, and my comically short sister who worked the day shift told me that she sometimes just leaped over the counter after closing up shop. I was now essentially standing in an island with only one route of escape if this creep decided to jump the counter. I took the opportunity while I had it and left the shop. It didn't end there though. My car was parked pretty far away, so I instead decided to run along the long service hall towards our stockroom. It was the only other door in the mall that I could lock and unlock, so I pushed my back against the door and locked the deadbolt behind me. Feeling better behind a locked door, I sat there watching YouTube under the blindingly bright ceiling lights. I felt secure and safe in that room right up until I heard footsteps coming slowly down the hallway. They were slow and light, like a kid tiptoeing down their stairs on Christmas. It was almost playful. I held my breath and waited for the footsteps to pass by my door. It was like they stopped just before it and started to walk in place as if it knew where I was but couldn't get to me. It was then that I heard these clicking and flickering sounds, some mix between the sound of keys jingling and lights popping on and off. Whatever was outside that door, it was just having its fun scaring me. I'm sure a lot of people have had a nightmare where they were running away from a threat that always knew exactly where their prey was. Felt like that, but I knew this was real. Luckily, I also knew I was safe. And at one point or another, I realized that the footsteps were gone. It wasn't until after I told this story to my coworkers later that I realized I never had to reopen the deadbolt to exit that stockroom. It was already unlocked. Since high school, I've realized that some of the most frustrating purchases end up being the most worthwhile. When I was 17, I decided to get my driver's license because I was tired of spending all my time at home with my parents. They weren't bad people, but my mom would constantly argue with my dad while watching the political news, and it became exhausting. After I got my license, I was using a tech service called QWERTY, but it went out of business and I was left without a phone. Since my parents insisted on me having a cell phone, I had to buy one on my own. They agreed to pay for it, but I had to work off the cost by doing chores around the house. I didn't live in a bad area, but the Radio Shack was in a rough part of town known for prostitution and drug activity. While I'd never heard of anyone being hurt, the area definitely had a sketchy vibe, and one particular apartment complex down the road was notorious for drug dealers and opioid addicts. It was closer to my house than I'd like to admit, but I didn't think much of it most of the time. So, I'm at Radio Shack, and the process to get my phone was anything but smooth. The girl who helped me first ended up activating the wrong phone and bricking it. Took forever to sort out. Finally, we got everything set up, and they told me to set up security on my phone and a backup passcode. I did, but it was one of those swipe pattern codes, and I forgot it as soon as I got into my dad's truck. I was driving back around 8 p.m. and had to stop at the intersection near the drug den apartments. I was coming from the east, heading west, and the road was pretty empty with just 2 other cars also going west. One truck turned right to go north, and a man was standing on the northwest corner waiting to cross. The orange PT Cruiser in front of me stopped at the red light, and we both waited to go. The truck turned, but I didn't notice the pedestrian, and when the light turned green, neither of us moved. I waited for a moment, then honked my horn, and the car ahead of me unexpectedly backed up a bit, which made me panic. I was still new to driving and froze up. I didn't put the car in reverse, but instead, I put it in park, pressing on the gas without moving. I was frantically trying to figure out which gear I was in, but couldn't find the display in my panic, and the orange PT Cruiser took off. I'll never forget the guy standing in the road ahead of me. To this day, I still worry about him when I have to drive around that area at night. He was about 5 feet 6 inches, slim with long limbs, and his face looked sunken. He had this unsettling zombie-like appearance, and his expression was twisted in anger. He was wearing a dirty, neutral-colored hoodie, but in the dark, it was hard to make out much more. I managed to lock the doors, but still couldn't figure out what gear I was in. I was totally frozen, staring at this man slinking toward me. He put his hand on the hood of the car, and it's cracked and bruised and dirty. I muster enough courage to look at him in the face, and I'll never forget seeing how much blood was just dripping off of him. I couldn't tell if he was badly injured because his face was just so dirty and bloody, but I had more than enough time to look. He crept up to the driver's side and tried to find the handle as I was trying to figure out the gears. I managed to pop it into neutral, and the truck made a strange noise that took him aback. But I wasn't moving, and he slammed his face against the window. He looked like he was bleeding from his eyes, but he definitely wasn't in pain. I mean, he laughed as I was panicking, and I could hear him tugging on the handle. Somehow, no other cars had stopped to help, even though I saw them passing by. I managed to find the right gear and tried to take off, but for some stupid fucking reason, I wanted to be a decent person and not run him over, so I took off slowly. I barely pressed on the gas when he pulled out a gun. I shrieked and slammed the gas and dragged him a bit, but he had his arm wrapped around the side mirror and he yelped and let go. I took off going 60 down the 35 to my house, and when I got in a full-on panic, my mom just chastised me for barging in like I did. When I tried to explain it, to my shame, I started to throw up and had to run to the bathroom. When I came out and explained, they told me to quit being a pansy and call the cops. For some reason, I was in trouble for almost being carjacked. I called the police, and the dispatcher said that I wasn't the only one calling about a man with bleeding eyes. After telling my parents, to which my mom was, well, gently put, skeptical, the doorbell rang. A deputy was at my door and asked to speak with me. My mom sent me in front of the officer, hoping that I'd confess to staging a hoax or apologize, and he asked me for a description. I gave him one and took him to the truck to show him the bloody face print on the window. He had someone take a sample, and he told me that they had a suspect in custody who perfectly matched my description of the man. He had a road rash and a dislocated shoulder, but wasn't in any mortal harm or anything. Now the cop left me with the number of his badge and squad car and told me to call him if I ever needed help with this again. He later appeared on the local news giving a statement to a string of attempted carjackings by a man who was reported to be on cocaine. He said that with the help of the people who gave statements and descriptions and the fact that he had a unique injury, finding the correct guy was pretty easy. He was carrying a loaded handgun that had not been fired, and no one but him was injured. The deputy said that the man had been in a fist fight nearby and had gotten beaten bloody, and the strange appearance of blood from his eyes was from ruptured blood vessels in his eyes and blood from his cheeks. He said that the man was in a stable condition and cooperating. He was sentenced on a drug charge, and I haven't heard anything about it since. But needless to say, when he pulled that gun, it scared the shit out of me. You never truly know a person until you're stuck in a car with them for hours. I learned that lesson the hard way, on a stretch of lonely highway, with a stranger whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes. What started as a simple act of kindness quickly turned into the most terrifying ride of my life. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I saw him, thumb out, standing by the side of the road. The sky was darkening, and the clouds overhead looked ready to burst with rain. I'm not one to pick up hitchhikers, but something about his tired, slumped posture and the barren landscape around us made me slow down. As I pulled over, I got a clearer look at him. He seemed fine enough, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing worn jeans and a jacket that had clearly seen better days. His hair was messy, and his shoes were covered in dirt, like he'd been walking for miles. He jogged up to the car with a grateful smile. "Thanks, man," he said as he climbed in. "Not many people stop anymore." I nodded, trying to remain casual. "Where you headed?" "Just down the road a bit," he replied, settling into the passenger seat. "Anywhere you're going is fine by me." I pulled back onto the road, the only sound in the car being the hum of the engine and the occasional swipe of the windshield wipers as they cleared the light rain now falling. "Been out here long?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "A couple of hours, I guess," he said, his voice flat. "Had a ride earlier, but they were going the wrong way." I nodded, not really sure what to say to that. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness outside deepening as we left the last light of twilight behind. After a while, he turned to face me. "So, you pick up hitchhikers often?" he asked. "Not really," I admitted. "First time, actually." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. "First time? Must be my lucky night." I forced a smile but didn't say anything. There was something in the way he said it that made my skin crawl. "You ever meet someone and just know they've done bad things?" he asked suddenly. I glanced at him, taken off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, still staring ahead. "You know, some people you can just tell. They've done things, hurt people, maybe even killed people." My heart skipped a beat. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I guess I don't really think about it." He chuckled again, that same low sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Yeah, most people don't, but I can always tell." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure how. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. We were miles from anywhere. No other cars on the road. No cell signal. "You ever do something you regret?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "Never," he pressed. "Never hurt someone, never thought about it." "No," I managed to say, my throat dry. He was silent for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me. "I have," he said finally. My stomach dropped. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. "Couple years ago," he continued, his voice casual as if he was discussing the weather. "Met this guy at a bar. He was mouthing off, saying things he shouldn't have. I didn't mean to hurt him. Not really. Just wanted to shut him up. But things got out of hand. I felt like I was going to be sick. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of sick joke." What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "He didn't make it. Cops never found out. It's not hard to hide something like that if you know what you're doing." Couldn't breathe. My palms were sweating on the steering wheel. I needed to get out of this car. Needed to get away from this man. "You ever wonder what it's like?" he asked, leaning closer to take someone's life. I shook my head violently. "No, never." He smiled, and it was the coldest, most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "It's not like they show in the movies. It's messier, louder. But once you do it, you get used to it. It gets easier." I was trembling now, unable to hide my fear. I needed to do something, to say something, but my mind was blank with terror. "Pull over," he said suddenly. "What?" "Pull over," he repeated, his voice harder now. "I need to stretch my legs." I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. If I stopped, would he try to hurt me? But if I didn't, what would he do? I said, "Pull over." He growled, and I felt something press against my side. I didn't need to look to know it was a knife. I eased the car onto the shoulder, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As soon as we stopped, he grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "Get out," he ordered. I didn't move, couldn't move. This was it. This was how I was going to die, on the side of some deserted highway at the hands of a murderer I'd willingly let into my car. I said, "Get out," he shouted, yanking me towards the door. In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. I threw the car into drive and floored it. The sudden movement caught him off guard and his grip on my arm loosened. I jerked the wheel hard, sending him crashing into the passenger door. He roared in anger, lunging at me with the knife. I ducked, feeling the blade whistle past my ear. The car swerved wildly as I struggled to keep control while fending him off. I don't know how long we fought like that, the car careening down the highway, his knife flashing in the darkness. At some point, I saw headlights in the distance. Hope surged through me. If I could just make it to that other car. With one hand on the wheel, I used the other to grab his wrist, trying to keep the knife away from me. We struggled, the car weaving back and forth across the road. The headlights grew closer. I could see now that it was a large truck. I steered towards it, praying the driver would see us, would stop to help. At the last second, my attacker saw what I was doing. With a snarl of rage, he jerked the wheel, sending us spinning off the road. The world spun and twisted, the sound of crunching metal and breaking glass ringing in my ears. When the motion finally ceased, I found myself hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Pain coursed through my body, and I could taste blood in my mouth. Through the shattered windshield, I could see the truck had stopped, its headlights illuminating the wreckage of my car. I turned my head, wincing from the pain, and looked at the passenger seat. It was empty. The door hung open, swaying gently in the night breeze. He was gone. I could hear voices and footsteps rushing towards the car. The truck driver, coming to help. I wanted to warn him, to tell him to be careful, that there was a dangerous man nearby. But darkness was creeping in at the edges of my vision, and I couldn't summon the strength to speak. As I drifted into unconsciousness, my final thought was of the hitchhiker. Where was he? Had he survived the crash? And if he had, who would be his next victim? I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. The police had their questions, of course, but there was no trace of the hitchhiker. No evidence he had ever been there. Aside from the cuts and bruises on my body and the terror that gripped me every time I closed my eyes, they found the knife, wedged under the passenger seat, right where he had been sitting. Proof that I hadn't imagined it all. I don't drive at night anymore. I don't pick up hitchhikers, obviously. But sometimes, when I'm on a long stretch of highway and I see a lone figure on the side of the road, I can't help but wonder, is it him? Is he still out there, thumbing rides and telling his horrifying stories? I also wonder about the people who stop for him. Do they make it to their destinations? Or do they become another story? Another confession whispered in the dark of a stranger's car? I'll never know. But I do know one thing. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they're sitting right next to you, smiling and telling you exactly who they are. And by the time you realize the danger, it's already too late. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see someone standing on the side of the road, think twice before you stop. Because you never know who might be getting into your car, and you never know if you'll make it to your destination. The kindness of strangers can be a double-edged sword. One moment you're grateful for the help, and the next you're fighting for your life. I learned this lesson on a lonely stretch of road, where a good Samaritan's smile hid the darkest of intentions. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. Just me, my old reliable car, and the open highway ahead. I'd made this drive countless times before, visiting my sister who lived 3 states over. But this time, fate had other plans. The trouble began about halfway through my journey. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with the hum of my engine and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. I was tired, but the coffee from my last rest stop kept me alert enough to navigate the empty stretches of highway. That's when I heard it. A strange rattling sound coming from under the hood. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping it was just road debris or my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the minutes ticked by, the sound grew louder, more insistent. Then, without warning, my car began to sputter. The engine coughed and wheezed, and I felt the vehicle losing power. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. I managed to steer the car onto the shoulder just as it gave its final, gasping shudder and died. I sat there for a moment, still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the situation. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, my phone showing no signal, and the nearest town miles away. Just as panic began to set in, I saw headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as a pickup truck slowed and pulled up behind me. Maybe my luck was turning around after all. A man stepped out of the truck, his features obscured by the glare of his headlights. As he approached my window, I could make out more details. He was tall, probably in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a worn baseball cap. "Having some trouble?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Yeah, my car just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about engines?" He chuckled. "As a matter of fact, I do. Pop the hood, and let's take a look." I did as he asked, grateful for the help. As he leaned over the engine, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite figure out what. "Looks like your alternator's shot," he said after a few minutes. "I can try to jumpstart it, but you won't get far. There's a town about 20 miles up the road with a mechanic. I can give you a tow if you'd like." I hesitated. The offer was tempting, but the idea of getting into a stranger's truck in the middle of the night made me uneasy. As if sensing my reluctance, he gave me a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'm not some ex-murderer," he joked. "Just a guy trying to help out. Name's Mike, by the way." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Mike seemed friendly enough, and I didn't have many other options. As he hitched my car to his truck, I gathered my purse and phone, sending up a silent prayer that I was making the right decision. The first few miles were uneventful. Mike kept up a steady stream of small talk, asking about my trip and commenting on the weather. But as we drove deeper into the night, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. We had passed a sign for the town he'd mentioned, but instead of turning off, Mike kept driving straight ahead. "I think we missed the turn," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Mike's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Oh, did we? Must have been distracted. No worries. I know a shortcut." But we didn't turn around. We just kept driving, the miles stretching out before us, taking us further and further from civilization. The unease I'd felt earlier bloomed into full-blown fear. "Where are we going?" I demanded, no longer able to hide the tremor in my voice. Mike's friendly demeanor vanished in an instant. His face hardened, and when he looked at me, his eyes were cold and empty. "Somewhere quiet," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Somewhere no one will hear you scream." Terror gripped me. This couldn't be happening. This was the stuff of nightmares and true crime podcasts, not something that happened to real people like me. I reached for the door handle, ready to jump out of the moving vehicle if I had to. But Mike was faster. He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he growled. "We're going awful fast. Might hurt yourself." My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. I thought about my phone, but even if I could reach it, there was still no signal. I was trapped, hurtling through the darkness with a man whose intentions were becoming clearer by the second. As we rounded a curve, I saw something that made my heart leap. Headlights in the distance and coming towards us. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. Without thinking, I lunged across Mike, grabbing the steering wheel and jerking it hard to the right. The truck swerved violently. Mike cursed, trying to regain control, but it was too late. We careened off the road, the world outside the windshield becoming a dizzying blur of trees and sky. The impact was deafening. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to Chow, the truck was on its side, smoke billowing from the crumpled hood. Mike was slumped over the steering wheel, unmoving. Pain radiated through my body, but adrenaline pushed it aside. I had to get out, had to get away. I fumbled with my seat belt, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative. Finally, it released, and I half fell, half crawled out of the shattered passenger window. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, clearing some of the fog from my mind. I could hear voices in the distance, the other driver, coming to investigate the crash. But I couldn't wait for them. I didn't know if Mike was still alive, still a threat. I stumbled into the woods, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put as much distance between myself and that truck as possible. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the dark forest. But eventually, my legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. As I lay there, leaves crunching beneath me, the full weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I began to sob, the sound echoing through the empty woods. I was lost, injured, and alone, but I was alive. I had escaped. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I heard something that made me want to cry with relief. Sirens, search parties, looking for survivors of the crash. I stumbled toward the sound, waving my arms and shouting hoarsely. When the rescue workers found me, I was a mess, covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn and dirty. But I was alive. Mike, they told me later, hadn't been so lucky. He died on impact. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the police and tried to process my trauma, I learned the full extent of Mike's crimes. He had been responsible for a string of disappearances along that highway, mostly women traveling alone. I had been his next victim. Now, years later, I still can't drive long distances alone. The sight of a pickup truck on a dark road is enough to trigger a panic attack. But I'm here, I'm alive, and I'm telling my story. Because the truth is, the world can be a dangerous place. Kindness can be a mask for cruelty, and help can be a trap. But we're stronger than we know, capable of fighting back, even in our darkest moments. So if you're ever stranded on a lonely road, and a stranger offers help, remember my story. Be cautious, trust your instincts, and never, ever be afraid to fight for your life. Because sometimes the difference between becoming a victim and becoming a survivor is a split-second decision to take control of your own fate. And to Mike, wherever his twisted soul ended up, I have one final message. You picked the wrong woman to mess with. I survived. I'm thriving. And your legacy will be nothing more than a cautionary tale. A reminder that evil doesn't always win. Sometimes the prey becomes the predator, and the hunter becomes the hunted. My husband, Michael, and I are in our early 30s, and we have 2 toddlers. The couple I'll talk about, I'll call Liz, and her husband we'll call Klinger. So here's how the story goes. I was scrolling through Facebook when I came across a post in one of our local Talk of the Town groups. Liz posted that she wasn't from the area and wanted to know where people hang out and make friends. Being my outgoing self, I decided to comment and say, "I'll be your friend." I know, it was a very dumb idea, and I let my overly trusting, friendly nature get the best of me. Liz and I started messaging each other on Facebook, and it quickly became clear that we had a lot in common. Klinger and I had mutual Facebook friends, which made me feel more comfortable about meeting up. I arranged for the 4 of us to get dinner and hang out. We had a good time, shared the same sense of humor, and before long, Liz and I were hanging out weekly, and Klinger was inviting Mike to play pool every week. Mike had a very demanding job, though, which made it hard for him to find time to hang out. And when he did have time, he was too tired. Well, this is when Klinger started to get a little crazy. Klinger asked if Mike could make it to one of their pool nights, and Mike had to say no because of work. Klinger completely freaked out. He started texting Mike, saying that he was being a part-time friend, and that he couldn't handle being friends with someone who didn't put in enough effort. He accused Mike of leading him on as a friend. Naturally, Mike and I thought, what the heck? What is wrong with this guy? Mike tried to explain that Klinger was overreacting and that he had obligations like work and family time. He told Klinger that he didn't have to be his friend and that Klinger should chill out. Mike ignored all of Klinger's messages, and we carried on with our days. Liz and I continued to hang out regularly, just the 2 of us, and we figured Mike and Klinger didn't have to be involved. I thought, okay, problem solved. Wrong. Klinger started messaging me saying that he doesn't understand why Mike wouldn't want to hang out with him and that he wasn't being nice. I tried explaining that he's got a lot going on and to chill out, This just made him angry, and he lashed out by saying that Mike didn't give me enough me time and that everyone deserves that. He insisted that Mike take time for himself and have a guy's night weekly. I told Klinger that him and Mike don't have to be friends and it's not a big deal. You would think I would have cut Liz and Klinger out of my life right then, but I thought that I could be friends with only Liz. I then started to notice that Liz was becoming too clingy and would get mad if I said I felt like just hanging out at home instead of with her. She made me feel guilty for wanting to have time alone. So my idiot self fell for it and thought that it would be wrong of me to leave her to be lonely as she didn't have anyone in the area. This in turn made me spend more money than we could afford as she always wanted to get drinks or food. Mike and I started arguing because Liz would twist things I said to her. Then Klinger would spit them out to Mike. I thought about ending our friendship, but I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. This all changed when I got a text from Liz asking if Mike and I would want to come over and do Molly with them. I'm not into drugs, except maybe smoking occasionally, so I definitely wasn't about to go over to their place to do Molly. I said that we wouldn't, and I'm not into that. Anyways, plus we didn't have a sitter. Liz had the audacity to say that I should bring our kids over with us and their kids could play with them. I told her absolutely not, and she got mad that I said it was a bad idea. Meanwhile, Klinger is nonstop texting Mike saying that he's just some alcoholic and that he doesn't give it to me enough. Mike and I were totally taken aback as this came out of nowhere, and I never complained about my intimacy to Liz or Klinger. In fact, I told Liz that I was pretty content with that. I did mention Mike drinking a lot at the time, but didn't go into further detail, and it wasn't some big secret. He had a drinking problem around this time, but that's a story for another time. Klinger then lectured Mike about him needing to quit drinking and that he's just a terrible father just like his dad. My husband has his share of issues, sure, but he's not just some terrible dad and has dramatically improved since this occurred. Klinger then said that our kids are annoying and ugly. He told Mike that our son shouldn't have a pacifier and how we are intentionally screwing up his teeth. Keep in mind that they were around 17 months, 3 years old with standard tantrums. Mike said that he was done with the conversation and that there was no reason for him to disrespect our family, which obviously included a few choice words. Mike said he doesn't care what he's into, but that Klinger seems to be looking for a boyfriend, not a friend, and he's not into men. Klinger lost his mind and told Mike that he would break him in half. Mike blocked him on everything. Then I texted Liz saying that our friendship was overdue to her psycho husband. After we blocked them, we didn't hear from them again, but I was nervous for a good month that Klinger would show up at our house and try to do something. It didn't help knowing that Klinger regularly went to the dark web and hearing all the horror stories surrounding that. Also, at the time, they lived about 10 minutes away. Thankfully, I knew beforehand that they would be moving to a city about 40 minutes away in the near future, so I knew it would be unlikely that I would run into them. So long story short, I learned the hard way that when it comes to friends, it's quality, not the quantity of friendships. We have a couple of good friends and are more than happy keeping it that way. The scratching from the attic was so faint at first, I almost convinced myself it was nothing more than my imagination. But as the days went by, it grew louder, more persistent, as if something was trying to claw its way out, or worse, claw its way in. I told myself it was just the house settling, maybe squirrels scurrying in the eaves. But deep down, I knew something was up there, something that didn't belong. And it was only a matter of time before I'd have to confront it. My name is Lisa, and I've always dreamed of owning a grand old house. So when I landed a job in a small town upstate and found a beautiful Victorian for a bargain, I jumped at the chance. Sure, it needed some work, but that was part of the appeal. I pictured myself slowly restoring it, uncovering its secrets room by room. The first few weeks were pure bliss. I threw myself into cleaning and minor repairs, reveling in the creaky floorboards and intricate moldings. The previous owners had left behind some furniture and knickknacks, which I planned to go through eventually. But for now, I was content to let the house reveal itself to me at its own pace. It was about a month in when I first heard the scratching. I was up late one night, reading in bed, when the sound grabbed my attention. Soft, rhythmic, coming from somewhere above me. I held my breath, listening closely, but it stopped just as quickly as it had begun. The next night, I heard it again. And the night after that. Always after dark. Always when the house was at its quietest. I tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize it away. Old houses make noises, right? It's perfectly normal. But the sound grew louder, more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear it during the day now, a frantic scratching that would send me rushing to the attic door in the hallway. But every time I opened it and shone a flashlight into the darkness, I saw nothing. No animals, no signs of life. Just dust and old boxes left by the previous owners. I started having trouble sleeping. Every creak, every groan of the house settling made me sit up straight in bed, heart pounding. Dark circles began to form under my eyes, and my coworkers started asking if I was okay. About 2 months into my stay, things escalated. One night, I woke to a massive crash from the attic. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over. Gathering all my courage, I grabbed a baseball bat and made my way up the narrow stairs to investigate. The beam of my flashlight flickered over piles of boxes and old furniture. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then my light landed on an overturned trunk. Its contents spilled across the floor. Old clothes, yellowed papers, and something else. Something that made my blood run cold. It was a doll, antique and eerily lifelike. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing. But its remaining eye seemed to stare right at me. I approached cautiously, my skin crawling. As I got closer, I noticed something clutched in the doll's hand. A piece of paper, old and brittle. With trembling fingers, I pried it free. It was a photograph, sepia-toned and faded. It showed a family standing in front of a house. My house, I realized with a start. A man, a woman, and between them, a little girl holding a doll. The same doll that now lay at my feet. I flipped the photo over. On the back, in spidery handwriting, was written the Coopers 18/97. Emily always did love that doll. A chill ran down my spine. I looked back at the doll, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn its eye moved, focusing on me with malevolent intent. I bolted, slamming the attic door behind me and not stopping until I was back in my bedroom, door locked and lights blazing. Sleep was impossible that night. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. The next day, I threw myself into researching the house's history. I discovered that the Coopers had been the original owners. They'd lived there happily for years until tragedy struck. Their daughter, Emily, had fallen ill and died at the age of 8. The parents had moved away shortly after. Unable to bear the memories, as I dug deeper, I found whispers of darker things. Rumors that Emily hadn't simply died, but had been the victim of some sort of ritual gone wrong. That her parents had dabbled in the occult, trying to cure her illness, and had instead unleashed something terrible. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. But now it wasn't just coming from the attic. It seemed to be in the walls, under the floorboards, all around me, and mixed with it. So faint, I could almost convince myself I was imagining it, was the sound of a child's laughter. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and fled to a hotel, planning to put the house on the market as soon as possible. But as I lay in the sterile hotel room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished. That by running away, I was condemning the next owners to the same fate. After a sleepless night, I made a decision. I had to go back, had to face whatever was in that house and put an end to it. I returned the next evening, armed with sage, holy water, and every protection charm I could find. As I approached the house, I could feel its malevolence, like a physical weight pressing down on me. Inside, everything was as I'd left it, but the air felt thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I made my way up to the attic, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The doll was where I'd left it, its one eye gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. But now, instead of fear, I felt a surge of anger. This thing, whatever it was, had no right to be here. This was my house now. "Emily," I said, my voice shaking only slightly. "I know you're here. I know what happened to you, but it's time for you to move on." The temperature in the attic plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost began to form on the windows. The doll's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and then I saw her, a shimmering, translucent figure of a little girl in an old-fashioned dress. Her face was hollow, her eyes sunken, filled with a mix of isolation and fury. "You can't make me leave," she said, her voice reverberating strangely. "This is my home. My dolly is here." I forced myself to stand my ground, resisting the urge to run. "No, Emily, this isn't your home anymore. You've been here too long. It's time to let go." She screamed then, a raw, heart-wrenching cry that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. Objects began to fly across the room, narrowly missing me. The doll levitated, its cracked face twisting into a monstrous grin. I don't know where I found the strength, but I stood firm. I started reciting the prayers and incantations I had memorized, my voice growing stronger with each word. I sprinkled holy water and lit the sage, filling the attic with its pungent smoke. Emily's form flickered, her scream turning into a mournful wail. The doll shuddered, then fell to the floor, its remaining eye popping out and rolling away. And just like that, it was over. The temperature rose. The objects that had been flying around the room dropped to the ground, and Emily's spirit seemed to dissipate, like mist vanishing in the sunlight. In her place, I briefly saw the image of a smiling, healthy girl who mouthed a silent thank you before fading completely. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted but victorious. The house felt different now, lighter in a way. The oppressive energy that had once filled it was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. In the days that followed, I made sure to properly bury the doll and all of Emily's remaining possessions in the local cemetery. I finished restoring the house, no longer afraid of what I might find. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear sounds from the attic. But now, instead of scratching, it's the soft creak of floorboards, as if someone is walking around up there. And sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I catch a fleeting glimpse of a little girl in an old-fashioned dress, smiling and playing. I don't fear these moments. Instead, they fill me with warmth because I know now that this house isn't just mine. It's a home for both the living and the memories of those who came before. And as long as I'm here, Emily will never be forgotten or alone again. It arrived in a plain cardboard box. No return address, no markings. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a misdelivered package. But my name was written on the label, in thick black ink. No sender, no note, just my name. Inside, wrapped in old, yellowed newspaper, was a doll. It was old porcelain, dressed in a tattered lace gown. Its glassy blue eyes stared blankly ahead, framed by tangled curls of dark hair. Something about it made my skin crawl. Its face was cracked, faint lines spiderwebbing across the pale surface. I should have thrown it away, but I didn't. That night, I set the doll on a shelf in my bedroom, facing away from my bed. The sight of it unsettled me, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old toy. At least, that's what I thought. Until I woke up at 3:12 a.m. The doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting in the chair across from my bed, its cracked face tilted slightly, as if watching me. My stomach twisted. I didn't remember moving it. No one else had been in my apartment. I forced myself to get up, grab the doll, and shove it into the closet. I shut the door, making sure it latched, then climbed back into bed. I barely slept. The next morning, the closet door was open. The doll was back on the chair. I threw it away immediately, stuffing it into a garbage bag and tossing it into the dumpster outside. Relief washed over me as I watched the lid slam shut. It was gone, or so I thought. That night, I heard the whispering, faint, almost too soft to hear, but constant. A rhythmic murmur drifting through my apartment like a draft. I followed the sound, heart pounding, until I reached my bedroom. The closet door was open again. The doll sat on the floor, staring at me, and this time its lips were moving. I ran. I checked into a hotel that night, too afraid to go back. But even there, I wasn't safe. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up to whispering, the same faint murmur, curling around the room like breath against my ear. I turned on the light, chest heaving, eyes scanning the room. Nothing. No one. Then I looked at my suitcase. The zipper was partially open. Something inside shifted. I reached out with a shaking hand, slowly pulling back the fabric. The doll was there, nestled among my clothes, smiling up at me. And this time I understood what it was whispering. "You let me in." I never went back to my apartment. I don't know what happened to it after that night, but the whispering followed me. I moved across the country, left everything behind. But no matter where I go, I wake up at exactly 3:12 a.m. Some nights, I hear faint rustling near my closet. Other nights, I feel a presence in the room, standing just beyond the edge of the bed. Then, last night, I woke up to something cold brushing against my hand. I turned on the light. The doll was sitting at the foot of my bed. Its cracked face was different now. It was smiling wider, and its porcelain fingers were reaching for me. It was the summer after I graduated high school when a good friend and I decided to try our hand at camping. We grew up in the greater Los Angeles area, so our knowledge of the outdoors was limited to a few years spent in Cub Scouts when we were in elementary school. In other words, we had absolutely no clue what we were doing. We packed a tent, sleeping bags, some supplies, and set off in his car. This was in the late 80s, before cell phones or other portable digital devices became widespread. We drove north on the 395 for about 6 hours and then turned west toward Inyo Canyon in the mountains. Our first mistake was not planning where we were going to camp. We decided to play it by ear, which was a big mistake. The second mistake was leaving in the afternoon, meaning it was pitch dark by the time we arrived in the area. We'd driven off the main road onto a dirt path, hoping to find a place to camp. The dust from the road was so thick that it overwhelmed our car's high beams when we pulled over to set up camp. It was around 11:30 p.m., and we were exhausted and starving. At that point, we would have camped anywhere just to rest. The third mistake was not bringing flashlights. The only light we had were Bic lighters for our cigarettes. We tried setting up the tent with the lighters and the car headlights, which were parked about 10 or 15 feet away. The wind was blowing hard, and the lighter kept going out either directly from the wind or because the wind would blow the flame into our thumbs. Clearly, we weren't thinking clearly. We eventually got the tent set up, but I was too tired to eat. My friend managed to make some instant ramen. We smoked a cigarette in the car and then crashed in the tent. The next morning, we woke up to a very cold start. It must have been around 5:30 a.m. When we stepped outside the tent, we realized we had camped right at the entrance of a hiking trail. There were at least 2 no camping signs, barely visible in the dark the night before. We quickly packed up, cleaned up the area, and left. That morning, we ended up in a small town where we bought cheap flashlights and a hot meal. The town wasn't much, more like a few storefronts along a main road, maybe the length of a typical city block. We went into an office, which I don't fully remember, but it may have been a park ranger station or a campground office. In any case, we reserved a site for the night. The campground was a large circle with campsites around the outer edge, spaced about 50 yards apart. In the center was a common bathroom and shower. We made our way around and saw only one family, all set up with a tent and camper. We found a spot quite a distance from them and set up camp. That night is when things started to get creepy. My friend and I were lying in the tent, shining our flashlights up and chatting. Eventually, both of our new flashlights died. Yes, both of them broke. Our fire pit, about 6 feet from the tent entrance, was reduced to just glowing embers. We probably should have completely put it out, and we probably shouldn't have had the tent so close. In any case, there we were, chatting away and having a good time. My friend began to be distracted with his foot. After the 3rd or 4th time, he got up to check his foot. I asked him what was wrong. He told me that something was tapping his foot from the outside of the tent. His foot was against the side of the tent. So from the outside, you would have been able to see a bulge in the tent side where his foot was. It was as if pebbles were being thrown at his foot through the tent. There it is again. What the heck? Each time it happened, there was a sound like pebbles or a light tap. We sort of laughed it off, assuming that it was a twig or grass moving in the wind or perhaps a loose strap on the outside of the tent. I don't recall exactly how it happened at first, but I do remember we suddenly became silent at the same time. A sound came to be audible to both of us. Footsteps slowly moving towards our tent. We wondered if it was a bear or other non-human animal, but it seemed distinctly bipedal. They were very slow and measured, like a step every 2 seconds. I finally said in a whisper, "Someone's out there." My friend didn't move. His face had an expression of fear. At some point, my friend bolted up and said, "F this." He grabbed his pipe, stuffed it full, and took the biggest, deepest drag I've ever seen a person take. About 1 or 2 minutes later, he was out. Smoking is not my thing, so I was alone in the tent as far as conscious bodies are concerned. I was sitting up at this point, and I had taken out the only weapon I had, a Swiss Army pocket knife. I took out the big and small blades, as well as the ice pick in the middle, and held it like some ridiculous melee weapon. I could see the glowing embers of the fire pit through the sheer nylon material of our tent, and I was able to roughly but barely discern some of the rocks around it. I watched and listened intently. The footsteps came closer and at the same slow pace. With each step, I could hear the dirt and rocks underfoot crunching and grinding. At some point, it was clear to me that whoever it was standing between the tent and the fire pit. For my fuzzy line of sight to the burning embers through the nylon tent became obscured by something outside of the tent. The footsteps stopped right at the front of our tent, about 6 to 8 inches from the entrance to the tent. It was silent for about 1 minute, and then I heard a click. At exactly the same time, I clearly saw through the nylon tent wall a flashlight turn on. I was able to see not just the flashlight, but the outline of the hand holding it. The flashlight was shining on the zipper entrance into the tent, just inches from the zipper. Blood drained out of my head, and my palms instantly became dripping in sweat. I yelled, "Who's there?" There was some fear in my voice, but it was mostly aggressive in tone. Whoever it was, the person immediately turned off their flashlight. I didn't move, but neither did they. The person just stood there, inches from the tent's only entrance. My friend is out, totally unaware of what's going on. Nevertheless, I pretended that he was still awake and whispered just loud enough to be audible to our visitor, "Yeah, loaded. There's one in the chamber," as if my friend was awake and asked me about a weapon. Fourth mistake, we did not have any real weapon for self-defense. It felt like an eternity, but after sitting still for at least 10 minutes, I heard feet slowly turning in the dirt, then slowly walking away from the tent. I stayed up the whole night, and it wasn't until the light of dawn came through the tent that I crashed out. The heat inside the tent woke us up, and it was near noon by this point. We went outside to inspect the site, but found nothing missing. However, we did find boot prints all over our campsite and leading away from the campsite and outside the campground. That was the last time I camped in a tent. After being in the game for 15 years, I've encountered my fair share of creeps, though only a few have genuinely made me feel unsafe. It all started when I was in high school and got my first laptop, a big deal at the time. I worked hard to buy it, but my mom always took any money I earned for things she didn't approve of. Fortunately, the money I earned from tips was cash, so it was easier to keep it hidden from her. Initially, my mom was upset that I spent my savings on a laptop, but it wasn't long before she forgot about it, just like everything else. My dad couldn't care less, and my older brother already had his own. So, at 14, I began playing World of Warcraft with him. Back then, it was rare to see girls playing. As expected, I got the usual creepy guys, but most would back off after learning how old I was. Not this one, though. This guy seemed to be more interested because I was underage. By the time I was 16, I was used to the creeps. I wasn't a newbie anymore, and I knew how to handle unwanted attention. So when a guy in my guild started flirting with me, it didn't surprise me. I was a stupid 16-year-old, But I understood that I wasn't going to find real love in World of Warcraft, where nobody knows you in real life. Plus, I had a massive crush on my brother's best friend, someone I could never have. So, turning down guys was easy even though I desperately wanted attention. That changed when my brother's friend went off to college. I had a part-time job with my brother's friend, but he was surrounded by girls at work, and it left me feeling like I'd never find love. That's when the 19-year-old guy on World of Warcraft started making me feel wanted. I had a camera phone by then, so I could post pictures on Facebook, MySpace, and PhotoBucket. I'd lost a lot of weight my sophomore year and, feeling confident, I posted bikini and sexy pictures in hopes of catching the attention of my brother's best friend, who was 19. So when this 19-year-old guy started liking me, it didn't really bother me. He looked good in his photos, and his younger brother was my age. I thought he was really attractive, and he proved it was really him by holding up items I asked for in his pictures. He started paying for my World of Warcraft subscription, which, in hindsight, was his way of getting my real name and home address. I was so naive and heartbroken over my brother's friend that all the lessons I'd learned about online safety and being strong against flirts seemed to vanish. We spent hours talking on Ventrilo, and he would compliment me, making me feel special. I was completely blinded at that point. He sent me gifts, and I didn't even question how he knew where to send them. Benny eventually offered to drive and pick me up, and that's when I started getting cold feet. Thankfully, I had a close friend on World of Warcraft, someone my brother met at PAX and joined our guild. To this day, they remain one of my best friends. He was 6 years older than me, but never made me feel uncomfortable. He was more like the protective older brother I never had. He caught onto the situation through our conversations and became my voice of reason when I was lacking my own. He sensed something was off when I couldn't, and I confided in him that I was nervous about meeting the guy because, in my naive teenage mind, I thought he wouldn't like me. My friend quickly pointed out that I shouldn't meet anyone off the internet at my age. I told him about the gifts, and I've never been scolded so fiercely in my life. Not even by my parents. But that's just how much he cared. He was baffled as to why I would give my address to someone I'd never met, especially when the expensive gifts I'd received weren't something the average 19-year-old could afford. Of course, none of it clicked for me because I was lonely and trying to prove something to myself, that I could get a boyfriend. So, I finally told the guy it wasn't wise for us to meet, and my parents forbade it. That's when he started acting strange. At first, it was endless messages, guilt-tripping me about the gifts he'd given me and trying to get me to go against my parents. Even though he kept bothering me, it never crossed my mind that he might lose control. My friend, however, was seriously concerned. He even considered driving the 11 hours to my house to explain the situation to my dad, since I refused to tell him myself out of fear of getting into trouble. He did all this while spending his spring break in my state instead of hanging out with his friends. There's a reason he's still one of my closest friends. He has a little sister my age, so his protective instincts were natural. Eventually, he made me block the guy, and that seemed to end it. But the guy didn't take it well. He created new accounts to accuse me of using him for his money and gifts. Thankfully, my friend was sharp enough to change my World of Warcraft password and even paid for my account, effectively cutting the guy out completely. One of his threats had been to delete my account. But that wasn't the end. The guy continued to find ways to message me, calling me horrible names. This dragged on for about a month. One day, I was walking home from school, about a 2-mile walk through the wealthy suburbs of New England, which I had done for years. It was common for kids to walk home there, as it was a very safe town with little to no crime. Without a second thought, I grabbed my 100-pound backpack, put in my headphones, and began my usual 20-minute walk home. It was cold, so I wore earmuffs over my headphones, which blocked out even more sound. Looking back, I would probably slap my younger self for being so careless. The World of Warcraft guy knew that I walked home every day because I had mentioned it before. He knew my address, and I never thought to question it. I was walking along the back roads, which were easy to map from my school to home, just one turn in between. Halfway home, as I was between songs, I heard a faint crunching sound, the tires of a car slowly rolling over gravel. I turned around and saw a black car with tinted windows, and I couldn't make out the driver at all. I jogged out of the driveway I was standing near, assuming the car was just waiting to turn in. But it didn't turn. The roads were empty, and it didn't make sense for the driver to be acting like this. The saying that you freeze when you're terrified is completely true. It could have been a scorching 95-degree summer day, but I felt frozen, like my body had no control. A cold wave of fear washed over me. My hands shook, tears welled up, and my skin felt tight. It was as though my body was incapable of deciding whether to fight or run. All I could do was freeze, feeling like I was about to collapse. It only worsened when I turned my head a second time, and the car stopped. I stopped. My whole world stopped. I couldn't look away. I just froze, my breath shallow as though a mountain of school books were pressing against my chest. I cried silently, with no sound or tears, just stood there, numb. The car door opened after what felt like an eternity, but it was only seconds, maybe a minute. And it was him, the guy from the pictures. Not a catfish, but something about him was off. At first, I thought it was his angry expression, but I soon realized he wasn't 19. He was easily in his 30s. My heart raced so loudly I could barely think, freezing me in place. I felt like I was about to be sick when he spoke, telling me to get in the car or he would burn my house down. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to grab my phone, his words turning me into stone. What neither of us noticed was the little old lady on her porch watching everything unfold. Suddenly, I heard her shout, "Get away from that girl right now, or I'll burn you alive." We both turned toward her, a small, angry woman, probably in her 60s or 70s, with white hair. I think she noticed how paralyzed I was because she immediately told me to get over to her. And without thinking, I bolted toward her, tossing off my heavy backpack. It was obvious that she wasn't going to back down. He hesitated, unsure of what to do as he stood there, watching me run to her. It must have been a sight. This tiny, frail woman standing in front of a teenage girl, shouting at a man to leave. Just like that, another savior appeared. Her husband stepped out, a man who looked like he'd seen more than his fair share of battles. His voice boomed, "I've killed men for less. You better leave now." The guy got into his car and sped off, and I collapsed, all the fear I'd been holding and pouring out as I cried harder than I ever had. My brain sifted through the past few months of bad decisions. After a while, the lady managed to calm me down enough to speak without hyperventilating. She asked if I knew him, and I told her, kind of, but only online, from a video game, not in real life. Explaining it wasn't easy. She immediately called the school counselor. Apparently, her daughter had mentioned my name, and though I wasn't close to her, I was well known to her, as there were only about 250 kids at our school, and the town itself was small. Most of the staff had family in town, either their own children or nieces and nephews attending school. It was the kind of town where, if you didn't leave by a certain age, you ended up staying forever. So, while it seemed ironic, it wasn't a huge surprise. The counselor was familiar with my family situation and my mom's addiction, as child services had been involved a few times. She arrived in about 10 minutes, picked me up, and asked me countless questions. She knew I didn't want to involve the police because I feared being taken away from my parents again. We weren't wealthy, but we had more than most. My mom worked, though my dad kept her on a tight budget to prevent her from buying prescriptions from Canada. She wasn't prescribed any of it. The counselor knew all this, and though she knew it would be tough, she believed I was better off at home than in foster care, which was a gamble at best. Plus, in 2 more years, I'd be off to college anyway. So we decided not to involve the police, but she made me promise to take the bus every day and to tell my dad about the situation. She also called my dad at work to update him and made sure a teacher would see to it that I got on the bus every day until I graduated. It sucked, but I understood. If that had been the end of it, it would have been a relief. But the story doesn't stop there. 2 days later, my dad had to fly out for business. With my brother away at college, it left me and my mom, who promised my dad she would stay sober while he was gone. I was used to helping her when she was intoxicated, almost like taking care of a child. But I was on edge. Every creak in the old house, the cat stirring at night, the dog barking outside. It all set me on edge and I barely slept. My World of Warcraft friend called every night to make sure I was okay for the past month. I lived in the middle of the woods, next to a huge river in the backyard, so there was always wildlife outside, and the dead silence of the cold months only heightened my anxiety. Running water is vital during winter when lakes freeze, and I was used to the usual bumps in the night, the cats coming and going, and dogs barking at any animal that wandered into the yard. But everything felt new as I lay in bed, trying to drown out my fears. The house I grew up in had 6 bedrooms. My little sister, who was 9, lived with my grandma in another state per court order, while I stayed with my parents as I was old enough to choose. The other rooms were a game room, my dad's office, and a guest room, mainly used when my sister visited. So, in a large house like that, isolated in the woods, it was incredibly frightening to feel like I was virtually alone, especially when my mom was defenseless. One night, as I let my last cat in for the night, I noticed a black car parked at the end of the long driveway between my neighbor's house and ours. I quickly shut the door and locked it once the cat was inside. I made sure all 5 doors were locked, even covering the glass doors to the pool with cardboard, hoping that if someone tried to break in, it would slow them down. I turned off all the lights and gathered all my cats into one room to make sure they were safe. Here's the thing about my dog. He wasn't very well trained, but he was still basically a giant puppy in his mind. He'd growl at strangers but never bark like he did at animals. We had to keep him outside when we had guests, but he never bit anyone. If you spent enough time with him, he'd eventually accept you. He didn't growl at all strangers either, so he wasn't the most dependable guard dog, but he was big, and he had a deep bark. I sat there in the dark with my dog, waiting for a shadow to pass by the window, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, I went upstairs to my mom's room and woke her up from her sleep-induced haze. Groggy and still somewhat intoxicated, she didn't quite understand what I was trying to say until I started crying. That's when she sobered up a little and asked me to get her some coffee, which I did, all while keeping an eye on my dog. I knew he could sense something before I did. As my mom woke up more, I could see the fear in her eyes. Eventually, she decided to call our neighbors to see if they recognized the car. When they all said no, 2 of the men left their houses to check it out. The car was empty. On closer inspection, they saw it was a newer Lexus, and in the passenger seat was a laptop. The car was locked, but with a flashlight, they could make out some details through the tinted windows. They never told us what they saw, but something about it made them decide to call the local sheriff. There was only one sheriff, and he lived in town. He arrived about 15 minutes later, ran the plates, and asked the neighbors what they knew. Apparently, it was a rental car from Ohio, but the rental office was closed, so he couldn't find out who had rented it right away. He waited in his car for about an hour until someone came out of the woods and ran back in when the cop shined his spotlight on him. I couldn't see what he was pointing at because it was on the side of the house, and I was watching from the front. It looked like he called for backup, because 3 more cop cars showed up within 5 minutes from the neighboring town. One of the officers, a woman, got out and I asked to speak with her. I requested that she call my school counselor to explain who might be involved. I was pretty shy back then, but something about speaking to a female cop made me feel more comfortable. I explained the situation to her, and she called my counselor, who confirmed my story. She also explained why I was so scared of cops, because of my past experiences with foster care and my fear of being sent back. During this time, my mom, who was mostly sober now, joined me. She hugged me and apologized, offering the comfort I needed, and then she called my dad. Eventually, the lady cop asked if she could check around the house to make sure everything was secure and to look for any clues on my laptop about the guy. While she was searching, she found something I hadn't even thought to check: the basement door. It wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open. It's never unlocked, so I hadn't even considered checking it. Our backyard tends to flood in the spring because of beaver dams, and the basement door had extra seals to prevent flooding. The ceiling materials around the basement door, mostly sandbags, had been moved aside, but the door at the bottom of the stairs was locked, although it had some noticeable damage, as if someone had tried to pick the lock. He did have access to half of the basement, which was used for storage, while the other half had been used for my brother's parties. The door between these sections was like a front door, sturdy and secure. In the summer, My dad would leave the hatch open to dry out the basement and adjust the pool settings since it doubled as the pool house. The cats loved it there, so we also had a few cat beds in that part of the basement. The section leading upstairs was locked from the inside, and the walls and door weren't made of drywall. They were built from cheap materials. However, the lock and heavy door were made of brick. When I noticed this, my dad confirmed he hadn't left the door open, and my suspicions that the black car might belong to him were nearly confirmed. As we walked through the house to make sure everything else was secure, the lady cop took my laptop to search it while they continued looking through the woods. I gave her everything I had on him, his photos, username, and she even checked to see if his credit card was still linked to my account, though it wasn't. However, the last few digits of the card were still visible. She then asked if she could keep my laptop for a few days, as she thought she might find useful evidence on it. I asked her not to damage it and to return it as soon as possible, since it was all I had at the time. This was before smartphones. After a few hours, and with the neighbors having gone to bed, the police returned empty-handed but left one officer outside our house and had the man's car towed. From what the lady cop told me, the car had multiple weapons, rope, and handcuffs inside. The guy who had run back into the woods was wearing a mask. Afterward, I tried to lay down and sleep, though I was pretty sure I would call out sick the next day. I kept all my cats inside too, just in case. I was too restless to sleep, and every noise made me jump. My mom slept with the dog in her room, and the cats usually stayed in my room by choice, since it was the warmest. At 3:30 a.m., I heard a knock at the back door, followed by a man's voice claiming to be an undercover police officer and demanding I open the door. Still awake, I walked downstairs and barely made out a figure standing in the dark with a weapon. When he saw me, he demanded that I let him in immediately to speak with me. Something felt wrong. My gut knew before I did that his voice seemed forced, like someone deliberately deepening it. And why was he at the back door? I turned on an outside light, and sure enough, it was him. I screamed. It wasn't a loud scream like in a horror movie, but more like a gasp, a reaction to the fear surging through my body. As soon as I screamed, he began pounding on the door. The banging was loud, but I ran to the front door to see the officer still standing outside. He was there, but he didn't get out of his car. I wasn't fast enough to run outside, so I turned the porch lights on and off a couple of times. Still, nothing happened. After a minute, my dog came charging down the stairs, barking and growling, nearly foaming at the mouth. My mom soon followed, angry and threatening the man. In the midst of all this, the officer outside had snuck around back and was now pointing his weapon at the man, shouting at him to drop his gun. I stayed hidden as everything unfolded, but he was arrested, and no trial required my attendance. My statement was enough. Turned out he wasn't even American. The car had been rented under his friend's name, and after everything was wrapped up, he was deported back to Canada. I assumed that something with his passport would prevent him from returning to the US, and the cop reassured me that he wouldn't be able to come back. I'm not entirely sure what he was charged with, but I think my dad mentioned aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, and possibly more. It also came out that he was 32, not 19, so being a minor probably added another charge. After that, life moved on. I've had my fair share of creeps before and after, but he was by far the worst I encountered from World of Warcraft. I've dealt with a couple more creepy situations from streaming, but I'm an adult now and much more skilled at staying safe online.